Welcome, one and all those who are watching me. I haven't streamed in a while, and I'm feeling kind of annoyed at the moment. So I thought, what better thing to do to lift one's mood than to return, like as they say, a dog to its vomit, to the real bottom barrels of internet apologetics, capturing Christianity. Actually, I don't think that capturing Christianity is bottom of the barrel, because the barrel is very deep, and some say it has no bottom, but there are, in fact, worse than capturing Christianity. That being said, I think Capturing Christianity is really giving some other channels a run for their money at the moment with some of the absolute nonsense that they've been putting out recently. And I thought, well, why not spend some time having a look at this pinnacle of the intellectual side of Christian belief? I could be doing productive things with my time, like, I don't know, scraping my head against the pavement outside, but needs must. Someone's got to respond to this, I suppose. I don't actually know if anyone's going to watch this live because I don't normally stream at this time, so I don't really know how this fits other time zones, but whatever, it doesn't really matter. People can watch it when they watch it. So let's have a look at what's been being posted on Cameron's channel in the last couple of months here. I think I responded to this one, didn't I? It doesn't show a view there, but I'm pretty sure I did that one, which would have been my last stream. So since then, we've had Do Atheists Desire a Savior, which is interesting. I like the little sociologist pointing to that guy's massive dome there. I don't know why that's of significance. Aliens. And I think there's maybe more alien videos in the edited videos here. He seems to be doing a lot of shorter ones these days. I don't know if that's oh look, more aliens. I don't know if that's there's a particular reason for that. More possession, of course, and demons, because why not? But let's focus on the live streams here. Does he do shorts? It doesn't actually say when these were posted, but I mean, shorts is just absolute cancer, so let's just not anyway. Yeah, so we got demons, we got aliens, we've got like pop culture. Apparently they're doing reviews of movies for some reason, because I guess that's what Capturing Christianity is about. It's reviewing popular movies. Look, another movie here, Sound of Freedom or something. So most of this is just kind of like, oh yeah, and Mr. Beast, because why not? We got trans and Mr. Beast. Like, is there anything that's more topical? So most of this I don't have any particular interest in responding to. As fun as it I'm sure would be to respond to Cameron talking about aliens. But there was one video that kind of caught my attention, which is this one. Now, where did it go? I can't find it. Not freaking Shroud of Turin. I just can't even with Shroud of Turin. Oh yeah, this one. Theism is irrational. Here's why. So this is a response to I can't think of his name at the moment. The well, we'll show in a second. The video here that it's a response. So I don't know that I've actually watched the original video, now that it comes to think of it, but I thought it could be interesting to see what their response is to the original video, to see their response to the original video, and see why theism isn't dumb. Atheists finally proved it. Time to pack up. Rationality rules. That's the one. Rationality rules this video. So, I mean, I don't actually know. I generally like rationality rules as... it's a bit awkward, isn't it? Rationality rules is... I generally like the stuff that Stephen on Rationality Rules puts out, although I haven't watched this particular video, and often it is a little bit not as in-depth as I would generally like. So, maybe I'll actually agree with Cameron on some stuff. But I don't know how much of this we're going to do. Let's just sort of take a look here. Are we in the right tab? We're not in the right tab. Let's just jump over to this one. I realize I'm sharing the wrong thing.
Hey guys, welcome to...
Oh, so before we do that, no. Or do we want to have live chat replay on? Oh, I think that might just be too much cringe even for me. Let's leave it on that. Yeah, thanks, Dribble. I appreciate that. Breaking it through to those who blindly follow him and others requires a slow and steady grinding erosion. Yeah, something like that. And it's just sort of like who erodes first, the content or you. Anyway, I don't know how long I'll have this afternoon, because I'm home alone at the moment, and I might be interrupted a bit later, but we'll see how we go. There was something else I was going to say. Oh, yes. The other thing I was going to say is that Capturing Christianity is a faster. Does the text actually get bigger when I do that? Is fast approaching 200,000 subscribers, which is a feat that I'm not sure I understand. His content is mostly quite bad. And even most Christians don't seem that interested in apologetics, to be honest. And most of his videos, as you might have seen, don't get that many views. There are some exceptions, which mainly are those relating to demons. So you can see they're like, we get a big one on Craig and Ehrman. Ehrman stuff usually gets a lot of views. Aliens one got a lot of views. Many of them, though, get less than 10,000 views, which of course is a lot, compared to my videos, but I have way fewer subs than he does. This debate one got quite a few, like 52K. The debate ones usually get more. Here's another debate one. You get people from like both sides watching it, so I think that adds to it. Another demons one that gets a crazy ton of views. Demons one with a crazy ton of views. I think it's interesting to see what gets a lot of engagement. It's like demons and debates, the double D, the big D. And then, yeah, occasionally a random thing will do well. Like, how did life? Oh, I guess that's a debate as well, so that falls into that category. But yeah, anyway, I guess the point is I don't really know why so many people subscribe to this channel when they don't seem to watch his videos that much. But whatever, they do, and so I don't know if we'll get some interesting content when he hits the 200K subscribers. But let's go back to the video and have a little watchy of that, shall we?
Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. Today, what we're doing is looking at a video. We're responding to a video from Rationality Rules Stephen Woodford entitled "Theism is Irrational," which was, from what I understand, an opening statement as part of a debate that he partook in. Is that the right term? Perry's actually the grammar Nazi. Is that the right way to say that? Partook?
I mean, I'm not a Nazi.
Got to watch it there, Cameron. I think that YouTube's cracking down on language that you use in the first portion of the video. I don't remember. I think it's like 11 seconds or something. So saying Nazi within the first 25 seconds of a video is a bit risky these days, but you might just have gotten away with it.
But I think that's acceptable.
Well, so he did this opening statement as part of a debate that he was a part of. And so what we're going to do is respond to it here. And I've got two guests joining me, Dr. Andrew Moon, right below me, who is a Christian philosopher who's specializing in epistemology. So he's joining me to discuss sort of the first part of this video. And then Dr. Perry Hendricks is joining me to respond to the problem of evil section, which is probably the most lengthy section of the video. I think it starts around the 2-minute mark. 3-minute mark, 2.5-minute mark, and goes all the way up to 7 minutes, I believe. So we're going to address the majority of this video. We'll look at the end briefly at the very end of this. So if you're interested in our thoughts on that, just stick around. We have 8 clips pulled up so far. So we're going to play those clips and then get a response from my two guests. And so is there anything that we'd like to say before we start looking at any of these clips?
What's this t-shirt this guy's wearing here? I protected Purdue. What's that about? It's a university, right? I'm curious as to what that is. I don't know if it has anything to do with that. Oh, is this a COVID thing, I think? Oh, I see. Just wondering.
From either of you guys. Let me say, to kind of start things off, when I watched this video, I wasn't really sure what I was looking at in terms of the graphics, okay? I was like, did he have this animated? But then after I watched only about 10 seconds, as someone who has dabbled in AI, like Midjourney and stuff, I noticed that he's actually using artificial intelligence to generate the graphics for this like weird.
Who cares?
From an aesthetic point, I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was really well done.
No, I don't care about that.
I with my own joke about like doing this interview over Zoom, but I didn't think it'd be remotely funny.
Oh my gosh. We'll say my jokes aren't funny.
I also enjoy the animations. And
yeah, I mean, I'm sure they're great, but I just don't actually care.
So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? And this is going to be a pretty chill stream today. So feel free, Andrew, and about 8 seconds long. So we'll play this clip and then get some commentary from Andrew.
Good. Now let's define rationality. Rationality is the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. And
okay, so that is our first clip. Pretty short.
I don't know that that's a very helpful definition of rationality based on reason or logic, although maybe he goes into it a bit more. I guess how would I define rationality? I don't even know. It's a very hard thing to define. Let's see what my little dictionary says here. Rationality, the fact of being rational, is very helpful. I think one way to say it would be to think or act in accordance with your reasons, but I don't know that that's very informative. Not rational. Yeah, reasonable and sensible. I think that one way a very simple way to describe rationality would be something like one reasons rationally when one reasons well in accordance with one's evidence and the principles of like valid inference or something like that. Maybe inference is a bit too fancy a word. So you're not making logical mistakes. You're not making jumps of reasoning. You're considering the evidence available to you properly. You're looking at multiple points of view and evaluating them on their merits, things like that. You know, I don't think it's anything super fancy or really esoteric, although it can be like subtle in points. You know, and I think rationality rules is probably going to agree with that broadly, I would guess. But anyway, let's see what they have to say about it.
But he basically says that rationality is based on reason or logic. So let's get some of your thoughts, Andrew. Go ahead and start us off on this one.
Yeah, so Cameron, as you mentioned, he gives two definitions, and they're actually not the same. And, you know, this is kind of it feels like a more of a popular level video.
Wow. Would you think, who would have thought that this like 7-minute long video, which is heavily animated, is a popular level video, especially coming from Rationality Rules, most of whose content is more at a popular level? I mean, come on. Yeah, I've always said this before, that it's appropriate to critique anything if it's like uses fallacious reasoning, but you also do have to consider the audience that it's designed for, and I try to do that as well. I don't hold a 7-minute popular video, animated popular video, to the same standard as, you know, a 1-hour lecture or something like that. You know, and I try to do that with my critiques. I don't think it would be reasonable to demand like a lengthy exposition on the nature of rationality here. I mean, well, let's see what he says.
And so I'm going to be kind of criticizing it as if it were, you know, something more scholarly.
Well, don't.
But
That doesn't make sense.
Point.
You criticize it for what it is. Now, if it doesn't serve the purpose for what it is, which, you know, arguable, defining rationality as reason as thinking in line with reason or logic, I don't know is that informative, which I think is a fair criticism. But yeah, I think that's
not a wrong thing, but more just maybe we can learn something
into it than should be.
from it. So
you can learn from it, I suppose. That's
so the concern about this definition, I wrote some things on my board here. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, let me go ahead and put
so
it
rationality, the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. So I thought this would be a good opportunity for people to learn just about what logic and reason are, and that'll help you see why this can't be a very good definition of rationality. The next definition will be better. So logicians typically care about truth-preserving inferences.
Does he? I didn't know that.
So here's one. So I say, all right, okay, all dogs are friendly. Fido is a dog, therefore Fido is friendly. So this is truth-preserving in this sense. Like if the premises are true, if it's true that all dogs are friendly and Fido is a dog, then it's got to be true that Fido is friendly. And that's a matter of logic. Logic is also concerned about truth-preserving inferences by virtue of form. So like this argument here, it could be put in the form all A's are B's, X is an A, X is a B. That's kind of a simple.
Well, here we're interpreting logic as formal logic. That's not the only way we can think about logic. Like what we're looking at here are like syllogisms. They're human inventions of ways of describing logical, well, maybe I shouldn't say logical, but they're ways of describing, let's say, good reasoning or forms of inference that we would affirm as being appropriate. Now, I don't think in using the word logic that Rationality Rules is trying to appeal to any very specific system of logic or type of logical inference. So saying that this is logic, I mean, yeah, this is a really classical type of logical inference with, you know, like syllogistic inferences here, but that there's all sorts of types of logic, and there's sort of formal and informal approaches to logic. So I don't know. Yeah, I guess if people don't know about this, you can teach them a little bit about forms of inference, which is fine. But I don't know that that's anything to do with the point that Stephen's trying to make in his video.
Wait, there's a better way to do this with predicate logic, but so
yeah, let's talk about predicate logic.
If these sentences are true, then this other sentence will be true.
Even if a bit of
Fido is a dog. So one of the questions for any theory.
I'm pretty sure that choppiness is on the end of the video. Let me know if I'm being choppy at all, but I don't think I am. Just so you guys know who are watching here.
Rational belief. Sorry, am I coming through still?
Yeah, you're coming through. There's just a little bit of a delay, and there seems to be some internet issues, but we can hear you fine. So just continue to go, even if it looks like it's a little bit choppy. Just keep on going unless I stop you.
Yeah, exactly.
So logic will maybe get you from one premise to another premise, but it's not going to tell you whether it's rational to believe the initial premise or even whether the initial premise is true, with some maybe minor exceptions. That's going to be a problem for the later discussion because, well, a lot of theists take belief in God or the proposition that God exists as one of their starting points, right? As one of their starting premises.
That's actually a good point, right? So if you just take belief in God as axiomatic, then it kind of by definition can't be logical in the sense of if you understand logic as some kind of inferential process, which I think is broadly true regardless of how you think about logic. It operates over some kind of inference. So you start with something and then you get to something else. Truth-preserving inference is the way he described it. Then anything that's taken purely as axiomatic without any kind of justification, or anything that's taken as like a properly basic belief or whatever else, can't really be logical. I suppose you could have a logical argument in addition to it, but at least primarily it would be a type of belief that doesn't stand in logical justification. Or it doesn't stand as being logically justified. Perhaps it could justify other things, but it would only stand at the start rather than sort of the end of a logical inference. That's actually interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. So it's almost like, yeah, certain approaches to theistic belief would kind of rule it out of from being a logical belief, which is interesting because, I mean, I feel like Stephen might be very happy to say, yeah, well exactly. That's my point.
Let's Plantinga, others, myself, and we think that the proposition that God exists can be one of your starting premises. Also, for some of us, it could be properly basic, right? That's kind of...
Well, properly basic is just like a whole lot of hot air as far as I'm concerned. But the thing is, any belief can be taken as basic or taken as like assumed to be true or taken to be true without evidence or argument. The question is whether it's reasonable or rational or logical or appropriate, or whether you're epistemically justified in doing so. There's different phrases or words you might want to use to describe that. But I mean, you can do it, right? The question is it, let's say, epistemically appropriate to do? And I think precisely Stephen's point is that it isn't appropriate to accept belief in God as a starting point like that. I mean, picking about the point of, well, no, it can't be logical because logic is about truth-preserving inferences. And if belief in God is properly basic, then it's not an inference. Therefore, yes, technically it's not logical, but then it's okay that it's not logical. I don't know. I feel like Stephen is just going to say, well, yeah, that's my point. You just believe it without any evidence or inference. So I don't know that that's really a rebuttal as an agreement with more words.
Use. That's hinting to the future, but for now, I can just mention that's why you wouldn't want to define rationality solely in terms of just a reason or logic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that make sense, Cameron? Any question of clarification or?
Well, what I was going to say is that he may be using logic in a different sense. So I think that
that's a good point.
It's almost like I think it would be like a synonym of reason. From like, if you just have a normal conversation with someone who's not really well versed in philosophy or anything or apologetics, they might use logic. And
imagine having a conversation with someone who's not very well versed in philosophy. I wonder where you could find such people.
Different way than we might use it as people who are more familiar with the way that it's used in academia. So we might use logic in the sense like you're using it, where it's truth preserving and you're looking at like a deductive argument, or you might be looking at different rules of inference. And so logic has, I think, it's used differently in the academic world than it is in the popular, everyday people world. And I think in that world, it means something like something that's reasonable or something that's based on reason, something. So it'd be almost like a synonym of reason. That would be the only pushback I could think of, is that he may be just defining or using the term logic in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very reasonable of Cameron to say. I don't know that Stephen was using logic in a very specific or academic sense there. I don't know why you would read it that way. Again, I don't know that saying rationality is about using reason and logic is that informative. I think it can be helpful for some people for whom big words, I mean, rationality is not really that big a word, but arguably rationality is not a word that a lot of ordinary people perhaps use, but although is logic, I don't know. Reason might be, like, what reason do you have or something. I tend to like saying reason and evidence or something like that. It's hard to know, but I guess the point is that for some people, certain words are blockers. And so what you can try to do is use different words which mean similar things to help them understand what you're saying. So like, what do you mean by rationality or rational? You say, well, I'm talking about, reason, logic, evidence, and then maybe they might get it. Like, that's not really a definition. It's just kind of helping someone to get what you're talking about. It's not super rigorous, but I don't know. That's what I gathered is what Stephen was trying to do. And, fair enough if you want a bit more rigor, but I don't know that it's...
I'm glad you're defending Stephen here. I'm open to that being true, but I think even when we use the word logic in its more informal sense, if you ask someone, can you know by logic alone whether all dogs are friendly? I don't know if people would say yes to that, whether logic alone.
Mm-hmm. I have no idea what most people would say to a question like that. But anyway, whatever. I don't really care about this point.
Function there, as long as one of the disjuncts doesn't really illuminate
blah, blah, blah.
what's going on, like what does it actually mean to be rational. And to be fair, he does go on to then give an example of what he means.
Well, why don't we look at the example
then? He sort of refines the definition a little bit later, so that's what we'll get to in just a moment. But
but Cameron, to push back, I think the same thing I said about logic can apply to reason. Like,
All right, I'm kind of over this point. Let's move to the next one.
I know that you wanted me to start this one a little bit later, but I'd like to actually...
Hang on, have we missed?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that's a good start. Should we move on and play the next clip? So what I'd like to do for this one, I know that you wanted me to start this one a little bit later, but I'd like to actually start it where we started.
Gee, people say I nitpick. That was like 14 minutes just on to be rational is to use reason and logic or something like that. Like that was the extent of the claim, and they talked about that for 14 minutes. I mean, well, yeah, my connection's fine. Thanks for that. Does that make the laws of logic illogical? Oh boy, we could talk about that for a very long time. You could we could maybe talk about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but that probably doesn't. Second incompleteness theorem, I think it is, but that's probably more than we need to get into now. So let's just
part of the previous one, so we'll get both definitions and his example, and that way we can get more of the context. So let me just go ahead and play the clip, and then we'll get going.
Now let's define rationality. Rationality is the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic, and I think it's best conveyed through an example. Hundreds of years ago, it was rational to believe that diseases such as cholera, chlamydia, and the Black Death were caused by miasma, bad air. After all, wherever there was foul odors, such as by sewers and crowded urban slums, there were diseases. Belief in miasma was based on the best evidence of the day. It was a rational belief. Today, however, we know that these diseases are not caused by bad air. We in fact have so much evidence to the contrary that we now consider it irrational to believe the miasma theory of disease.
Yeah, what I would say here is, as I would tend to, I bring the concept of evidence into it. I mean, you know, I'm an empiricist. It's not surprising. I like to point to evidence. I think Stephen probably is some kind of empiricist as well. I think it might have been better, instead of saying reason and logic, to say reason and evidence. One advantage of that is that the two are more clearly dissimilar. I mean, for the philosophically minded, it appeals to the kind of rationalism versus empiricism debate, and you can just sort of say, well, I'm talking about both of those things. Reason is more, you can think of it as an internal intellectual thinking aspect, whereas evidence is a bit more empirical, look into the world and collect data kind of thing. Obviously, you know, they sort of interact in a lot of ways, so they're not entirely separable, but I don't know. I would probably say reason and evidence rather than reason and logic. And the example that he gave appeals to the concept of using evidence a lot more. So I don't know. It's a sort of a nitpick. I think most of the audience to whom he's appealing is not going to really notice that point.
Your belief is,
but yeah, you know,
I
guess
a little bit early. Let me go ahead and continue.
Kind of
rational then, if and only if that belief is in accordance with the reason and evidence available to the belief.
Yeah, so here he says reason and evidence.
Again, I stopped that a little bit early, but you can see it on the screen there. A belief is rational if it's in accordance with the reason and evidence available to the believer. Now, one question I would have, and this would have to just be directed at Stephen, and if he's here, then he can just leave it in the comments and let us know. But I wonder if he was thinking that evidence was a synonym for logic, if he was using those two interchangeably, which I think would have another set of problems if that's what he was doing. But that's kind of what it seems like he's doing here. Or maybe it was, I don't know. That's why I wanted to just ask him.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Cameron here, because here he Stephen does use a similar language than he did when he was defining rationality, but instead of logic, he says evidence. That is potentially a bit confusing. I don't know that it matters that much for the points that he's going to make. But yeah, I think probably it would be better just to stick with a similar phrasing and say reason and evidence, probably, rather than pulling logic into it. Yeah, maybe I agree with Cameron here.
Directly if he is watching this. But yeah, Andrew, go ahead and explain what you think about this clip here.
So I think this definition of rationality is much better. I have it on my board, but I guess it's right there in the caption. So
I don't know that he's trying to define it though. He's trying to illustrate what it is. I think definition is too narrow a way to think about it.
Things I like better about this definition. First, it makes clear that rationality is person relative. So most philosophers will agree that truth is not relative. Normally, what you hear from the truth is relative, man. Well, that's not correct. But what's more likely correct is that rationality is relative. So it's rational for one person to believe is different for what's rational for another person to believe.
To say that Stephen is saying that evidence and logic are synonym is a pretty bad faith interpretation. I think it's better faith is just that he's used different descriptions in the two segments, which I think is a bit confusing, but I also don't think it's that big a deal for the type of video this is. What counts as evidence? Very good question. I'm not going to answer that. I mean, in philosophy, I think a popular view is to say that evidence is anything that increases the probability of a belief being true or a proposition being true. That doesn't really answer the question in a way that's going to be very satisfying. But I don't know if Stephen is going to answer that question.
And I thought his disease example was really clear about that. Given that the evidence that they had back then, what was rational for them to believe was different from what's rational for us to believe. Now, the funny result about that is whether it's rational to believe in theism is also going to then be dependent on a person's evidence. So that's just good to keep in mind. When you see a video that says, theism is irrational or theism is rational, you got to be careful. It might be that depending on the person's evidence, theistic belief might be rational for some, but it won't be rational for other people.
Mhm.
So that's just the first point. The second point is this definition he gives, he just take out the reason part. So a rational belief or a belief is rational if and only
Yeah,
if
this
it's
is fine. I'm just kind of bored of
evidentialist.
this discussion. I want to get to
Suppose
the actual meat
Sure,
of the
you get
video.
from Alvin Plantinga
What's
was
this about?
propositional evidence.
Oh, okay. We're talking about different types of evidence here. Hang on, this could be relevant. Let's jump back a little bit.
Epistemologists disagree about, like, there are many different views about what gets to count as evidence. And so this is just one picture that I find plausible. It's the picture you get from Alvin Plantinga in his book Warrant and Proper Function. Okay, so he divides evidence.
If Alvin Plantinga says that it's probably wrong. Oh, that's a bit unfair. I want to make a stylistic point. I don't like this style of holding up a notepad to the camera. I find it hard to read and it just looks a bit messy. I think you can just use slides for this, but that's just my opinion.
Into three types.
That's just your
Okay, so
opinion,
I'm
man.
going to use my board again. So there's what he calls propositional evidence. And, like I gave in the example earlier, all dogs are friendly, Fido is a dog, therefore Fido is friendly. That would be propositional evidence where you're believing a conclusion.
So I'm sort of in, let's philosophically nitpick this mode, but I was, given what this guy said before, but I'm reminding myself that Plantinga is an externalist about epistemic justification. So I suppose it makes sense for him to divide it this way. The first thing I was going to say is that typically in philosophy, or at least, yeah, maybe this is a bit of an older view now, but a classical view would be to say that propositions are the bearers of truth and falsity, and justificatory or evidential relations hold between propositions. So in other words, technically speaking, the only thing that could be evidence for anything is another proposition. Yeah, I'm just thinking here that, I mean, there are views that still hold this. There are variations which might say that the only thing that can be evidence is a belief. So if you think that, if you're an epistemic internalist and you think that what justifies a belief is a different belief, then you might say what a belief expresses is an attitude towards a proposition. And so whether you say the beliefs, there's a justificatory relation that stands between the beliefs, like, I don't know, my belief about bad smells co-occurring with disease, and then my belief about the cause of diseases, those are two beliefs, and you might say there's a justificatory relation there. Or you might say the relationship is actually between the propositions, which is maybe some abstract entity that the beliefs express or relate to. But anyway, the point is that under that view, the only thing that can be evidence is a proposition, or like some proposition tokens or something. But if you're an externalist, you think that things that are not beliefs or things that are not propositions can stand in justificatory relationships. So like, let's take senses, for example. So a sense impression is, just like a sense image or a sound or something like that is arguably not propositional in a way that a belief is. Like, it doesn't have propositional content. But if you think that, a sense image or a sense impression or a sense perception can directly stand in a justificatory relation with your belief, then you might think that it's not just propositions or beliefs that can do justifying. It's also like sense perceptions or something of that sort. And I mean, there are stronger externalist views which say that states of affairs in the world could stand in justificatory relations with our beliefs. This last one here of Plantinga, intellectual seemings. I haven't read Plantinga talk about this specifically, or at least not as far as I remember. It'd be interesting to see what this guy's Moon, right? About what Moon has to say. I hope I've got his name right. Jeez, does it not even say who he's talking to here? That's weird. It's all this stuff. He doesn't actually say who his guests are. Yeah, he doesn't put his guests in his video description. That is odd. Anyway, whatever. I'm pretty sure this guy's called Moon. It'd be interesting to hear what he has to say about this, because this sounds like complete waffle to me. But anyway, I guess the meta point I'm making here is that this sort of trichotomy here is going to be pretty specific to the attitude you take towards evidence. Let's hear how he describes
based on
it.
premises, where those premises are propositions. So whenever you're believing the conclusion on the basis of any sort of logical support, on the basis of other premises or propositions, that's called propositional evidence. And it's the sort that you see most focused on in philosophy discussions, because we care about arguments. A second type of evidence is, he calls it sensuous evidence. Nobody really calls it that now.
Sensuous evidence.
Sensory evidence. So this is just evidence you get from your senses.
No, that's the sort of evidence I can get behind. Am I right? Sensuous. Sorry. We've got a good question here. Is an explanation of sense perception a propositional evidence? Yeah, I mean, this is where you get a lot of debates in epistemology about how to factor in sense perceptions. I personally don't think that there is a meaningful distinction between propositional beliefs and, let's say, sense perceptions in terms of like cognitive science or neuroscience. And as such, I don't think that the distinctions that are drawn in the philosophy literature about this are very informative. The way I would tend to say it is that mental states stand in justificatory relation to other mental states. Maybe not all mental states, like we could look at what types of mental states. But the point here is that it doesn't have to be necessarily a conscious mental state. Whether it's propositional or not is, I don't think, that important. And so we can sidestep some of these issues about like, sense data theory and other things where the issue becomes like, are our sense perceptions kind of given to us? Are they just sort of incorrigible and entirely determined from the outside in some sense? Or are they something that we kind of interpret, that we bring an interpretive lens to? And there's people who kind of argue about this depending on like the level of processing. I mean, obviously we interpret them to some extent, right? You'll have, but some people say, well, yeah, sure, you give an interpretation to your sense perception, but there's some base raw perception there which is non-interpreted, and then you interpret it, and right, that basal kind of raw perception there is the kind of raw data that you're working with when you process that, and that raw sense perception, I'm saying raw, I don't know that that's the right word, but that direct sense perception is caused by the external world, and it is what stands in justificatory relation to your beliefs. It's not some other belief. It's not like your interpretation of the sense perception which justifies your beliefs. It's actually the sense perception itself which is directly caused by the external world. So this is one way of trying to articulate the relationship between our beliefs and the world in a way that is not, that the world does a lot more justificatory work compared to just our beliefs. As I said, I kind of don't think this distinction is really that helpful. I think that perception is very complex, and pretty much from the beginning, there's a sort of iterative process of increasing abstraction and kind of top-down and bottom-up iterative processing, where it's kind of meaningless to talk about whether it's like purely given by the world or whether it's interpreted. And so I just think it's more sensible to talk about mental states and the justificatory relations they stand in. So you can say things like, I'm justified in believing there's a tree over there because I see a tree. But by the phrase, I see a tree, right, that's shorthand for a whole bunch of complex cognitive processes that are going on. And then we can explain why we're justified in believing the outputs of those because of, coherence relations or I mean, there's various things that you can say. But I guess, again, the summary point is that I wouldn't really say that these are two very distinct processes. It's more like, I was going to say a spectrum. I don't even know that that's the right way to think about it. But like some types of reasoning are very deliberative and it's kind of focusing on executive function, like logical inference with, thinking through abstractions or doing math problems. And some are much more based on kind of direct perceptual interaction with the environment and forming a lot of unconscious processing that happens as we think about things. That list needs more demons and aliens. Yeah, agreed. I don't quite know where, where does the Holy Spirit fit in, for example? Maybe that's an intellectual seeming, but is the Holy Spirit purely intellectual? I don't know that that's appropriate. So, I'm kind of happy with 1 and 2, although I don't really see them as a dichotomy. Part of my criticism of a lot of philosophy is that claims are made about the nature of cognition that have no interaction at all with cognitive science or neuroscience or really anything. So it's like, well, sure, you can say that there are these two baskets, but that's just your way of describing things. It's not clear that there's actually corresponds to anything in the world. Anyway, let's see what he has to say about number 3, because I'm kind of interested in this. If it looks to you
an object is red or round, I mean, that's sensory evidence. If you if I touch the screen and it feels a certain way, then let's say it feels hard, then I'll have evidence that the screen is hard. Smell, taste, touch. So that's going to be your sensory evidence. And the last type of evidence is, he calls it impulsional evidence. This is back in
the way that he described sensory evidence doesn't seem to distinguish it from propositional, because he stated it like, it feels hard, therefore I think it is hard. Like that sounds propositional. I think the idea of sensory evidence is that it's not supposed to be propositional, or at least it's not necessarily propositional. Again, I'm not exactly sure how to draw these distinctions. I think it's a bit hard to do, but never mind.
1993, nobody really calls it that anymore. Now they're just called something like intellectual seemings, or maybe even just seemings. And this is just this sort of evidence is what seems true to you. So it might seem to you that nothing can be black and white all over at the same time. Or it might seem to you that nothing could be a square circle, or that 1 + 1 = 2, or all bachelors are unmarried. So these are intellectual seemings. Many people have heard about trolley cases where you're asked, does it seem wrong to kill one person to save 5 people? And a lot of them will say, yes, that is wrong, at least in some cases. And that's a seeming. These are also called intuitions. So
intuitions, yeah. I think that's
so yeah,
more
these would be
common
3
word.
types of evidence. And just pointing out, the propositional one is the logic one, the one focused on logic. And earlier I asked the question, well, what's going to be your evidence for the premises of these arguments?
I don't think it should be that controversial to say that a lot of atheists, especially naturalists, of whom I would count myself one, and I think rationality rules is as well, are going to be pretty skeptical of number 3 here. This notion of intuition as somehow a separate source of evidence. Now, certain intuitions may have evidentiary value. If we train ourselves to be accurate perceivers of something. I think the example that's often given in literature is chicken or chick sexes, sexors, like that they identify the sex of a chick just by kind of looking at it and touching it or something. I don't know how they do it, but I guess the point is that they can't necessarily articulate how they do it either. So it seems to be kind of non-propositional. Although you could argue, well, isn't it sensory? Yeah, I don't know. I guess a different example would be like when considering abstract thought experiments like the trolley problem. That doesn't really seem sensory in any sense, but it also doesn't seem propositional if you can't, give an argument for it. If you just sort of say, well, it seems wrong to me, arguably that's some kind of intuition. Now, to me, all that's happening there is that there's a series of some kind of inference or inferential steps or reasoning process that's happening that's just not consciously accessible. Maybe sometimes we can consciously access it if we think about it really hard. We can figure out the reason. I mean, it's not uncommon. Maybe if after you've watched a movie, for example, or I don't know, been visited somewhere or had a conversation with someone and you're thinking afterwards, I really didn't like that. It rubbed me the wrong way, or it seemed off in some way, but you can't quite say how or why. And then maybe later you think about it, you're like, actually this was the reason. Or maybe someone articulates it for you and they say like, oh, this is what I didn't like about that movie, or this is what, felt weird about this person. And you're like, yes, that's it. You've put into words what I was thinking. So this is the sort of phenomenon I think happens where we maybe form a belief or form a judgment about something, but we don't quite know why or how. We can't really articulate it. So it's not really propositional, but it doesn't quite seem sensory either. It's not directly related to any particular sense perception. I mean, obviously the idea of it got into us through some sense perception, but the idea itself is not a sense perception. There's something more going on there, and plausibly it's just some combination of like subconscious or cognitively inaccessible processing that like we can't see into. It's not transparent to us, or at least not readily so. But that doesn't mean that there's not like processes happening under there. So I don't really see the justification, or maybe not the right word here. I don't really see the argument for why we should think of this intuitions as somehow a separate class of evidence from anything else. And particularly, I dislike people who kind of reify intuitions as if they're a really important source of knowledge. I mean, I think many of our intuitions are very highly unreliable. Not all of them, right? But it depends. It's very case by case. I wouldn't say, intuition is a source of knowledge. I think that intuition is often very misguided. You have to ask more about the processes and like what's the domain, what's the relevant experience the person has, and other things like that. So I'm not really sure that the intuition itself does any justifying. It seems to me that if to justify an intuition, you would point to other factors, which like maybe your experience or your track record or something like that of success. Or maybe you can think through it a bit more and give a propositional justification of your intuition. Whatever it is, it seems to me that those things are probably going to be doing the justificatory work and not the actual intuition itself. So I'm pretty skeptical about intuitions as a source of justification.
And that's where normally sensory or intellectual seemings will come in. Those will be what support your belief in the premises. Okay,
yeah, that's helpful.
Any thoughts about that, or?
No, I think that was pretty straightforward. But this is going to be relevant a little bit later on. One thing that I did want to point out
kind of annoys me that we just sort of accept Plantinga's categorization there without critical comment. Not to say that you can't, adopt someone's framework if you like it, but like it's not like Stephen, for example, is likely to be operating in accordance with that framework, and so to like just say we're just going to use this framework to judge what he's saying here without justifying why we should use that framework or why it's appropriate. I don't know. It just seems a bit lame to me. Quick look at the comments here. Yeah, this is an interesting point here. I do taxes professionally, and yes, I do trust my intuitions from time to time within my field, but unless I've checked everything, I don't say I've done my job. Yeah, I think that's an example. Like when you have professional experience with something, you can develop an intuition. It seems to me that and those intuitions may well be reliable, but that is going to be restricted to a particular domain, right? It's not intuitions generally, it's intuitions of a certain sort. And the other thing is, it seems to me what does the justification there is some combination of your experience with that, a successful track record, and also your ability to, after the fact, like articulate the reasons for it or go through the steps. Intuition may be like a shortcut for getting you there, but the actual, I don't know that that's a strong justification. Maybe it's a weak justification, but then you can justify it more fully when you go through it carefully. I think there's different ways you can articulate it, but I think it's, I'd be quite reluctant to say that intuition itself is intuition by itself and of itself is doing a lot of justificatory work there without further qualifications. But I get the sense that Moon might be a bit less critical about.
Is that part of the definition? Let me pull it back on the screen here. Is that he says it's got to be within the reason and evidence available to the believer. I wanted to kind of highlight the word available. So there's a few different senses of what it could mean to be available to someone, especially when we're talking about evidence. So let me just give a different example. So there's a couple things that are available to me immediately, not in terms of evidence, but just something that's available, like my pen or my phone, my mouse. There's different things that are available immediately to me right here in front of me. There's other things that are available should I decide to get up and move around or even travel. So I could travel to, I've got family that lives in Austin. I could travel to Austin and then get something from them. That would be quote unquote available, but it's not immediately available to me. So we've got to sort of define what we mean by available. There's another, to make it even more extreme, it's in one sense, it could be that $1 million is available to me. I don't have $1 million right now, but in the future, I could make enough money so that it would be available.
Yeah, I kind of see what he's getting at here, but I'm not really very interested in this question. Maybe you could say reasonably available or accessible without too much work. But let's move on to the next point. Oh, we're going back to this again.
That you believe in an argument, or your sensory experiences, or your seemings, those are all within your mind, and so they are available to your mind. Something like, let's say I have a theory that I really like, and then somebody sent me an email that has a devastating counterexample, but I haven't seen the email yet. I mean, if I haven't seen the email yet, then I can still be rational in believing my theory. It'll only be when I read the email and get that evidence, it becomes internal to my mind. It's only then that I can I would stop being rational in believing.
Yeah,
that's going to be internalist.
That's the question that I'd have with respect to this definition of rationality. Is I think it depends on how accessible, or are you in already possession of this evidence? And it seems like Stephen wants to say that you don't have to be in possession of it to be irrational. If you're not in possession, like just the fact that evidence exists somewhere, even if it's not directly or immediately accessible to you, that still makes you irrational because it exists, but you're not you don't have immediate grasp of it. But it nevertheless exists, and so that's what sort of makes you. That was the sense that I got when he said that belief in miasma is now irrational because that evidence exists, even if someone held that belief and didn't have the counter evidence, it would still be irrational for them. And I think that's this, like, I'm trying to be, again, as charitable as possible here. I think that's what he's saying. So it could be that I'm mistaken. I could just be wrong, that's not what he believes, but I think that's what's going on, given what he says about the problem of evil. Like some Christians haven't thought too deeply about the problem of evil or the problem of religious disagreement or the argument from divine hiddenness. A lot of Christians haven't really critically thought about their beliefs or objections to their beliefs, or they haven't considered, for example, Michael Tooley's argument from evil, like his very specific formulation of the problem of evil. They haven't considered that, or Paul Draper's argument from evil. There's a lot of literature out there that Christians.
I really couldn't care less about debating whether a certain person or class of people is rational or irrational for holding certain beliefs. It really just seems how you define your terms there. I think it's fine to say that a certain belief is sort of unqualifiedly irrational, like, I don't know, believing in a flat Earth, or the proposition that the Earth is flat is irrational. Even if there are some people who might not have access to the evidence themselves, that renders that irrational. I think as a sort of a shorthand, you can just say that the quantity and quality of evidence that we have against certain propositions is such that for all intents and purposes, we can just make a blanket statement and say it's just irrational, like believing that. We can kind of make that as a general statement without specifying exactly whom we're talking about there. I think that's fine. For ordinary conversation, I think it's fine to basically what you're doing is you're making a statement about the quality of evidence or arguments, reasons available for a particular proposition. You're not actually making a statement about the epistemic status of any particular individual. And this is much more interesting to me. You're talking about the arguments or the status of the belief. You're not actually talking about individual people. So, yeah, I mean, in philosophy, you typically not say a belief, like you probably wouldn't say Christianity is irrational. You might just say the arguments for it are weak, or it's poorly supported, or something like that. But, you know, if you want to define your words a bit differently, you can call arguments irrational instead of people. Like, I don't think it's very important, and I don't care very much. I'm much more interested in just talking about what is the evidence and the arguments in favor of or against a different position, rather than try to weigh up the epistemic praise or blame that particular people are going to be in.
On that counterexample, does that then make you irrational? I think my intuition is that that's when irrationality happens.
I think people thousands of years ago, maybe certain people didn't have access to the astronomical evidence. I think they were rational in believing the Earth was flat. Now, was there evidence that the Earth was round? I mean, the evidence existed, like in some form. I mean, like it was.
By the way, one problem with this, which William Lane Craig has raised, is that if you say that say theism, or even Christianity to be more specific, is if you say that belief in theism or Christianity is a is a position that you can be in, either you can hold either rationally or irrationally, depending on the contingent state of the evidence and reasons that you have available to you, then it seems you're in a position to say that at least at some points in history, at least possibly actually, but at least even possibly, there were some people at some places in history for whom it was rational for them to reject God, or even to reject Christianity more specifically, like contingent on their specific epistemic situation. And for Craig, at least, that's far too much. He says, well, no, it's actually, we can't have a situation where it's contingently rational for people to reject Jesus. And so that's one of the reasons that motivates him towards the idea that it's actually, everyone always has a sufficient reason. I think he uses the phrase reason, justification, whatever word he uses. Everyone has sufficient warrant, justification, whatever, to believe in Christianity because of the inherent witness of the Spirit, or some nonsense like that. But basically what Craig is doing here is identifying that if you relativize justification to someone's epistemic status, then at least if you relativize justification to someone's epistemic situation, their like environment and what they have access to, then at least contingently, at least possibly, certain people could be rational in rejecting God or rejecting Jesus. Even if that's not true for most people, it could be true for some people. And even that sort of modest concession is going to be a problem for some people like Craig. So this line of reasoning can get a bit difficult for Christians, even if they want to say to an educated Westerner, it's rational to believe in God. Is it rational for everyone right now for them to believe in God? And if the answer is no, then, well, I think you get into divine hiddenness objections and other problems like that. So I don't know if they discussed that at all.
It's still there. Like if you were able to get outside the atmosphere, you could see that the Earth is round. So that's what pushes me to think, well, yeah, it's got to be something internally available. So I'm kind of agreeing with you. But if you get that result, then
you can't just say that theism is irrational. It's got to be person relative. You've got to look at each individual case, find out what this person is aware of.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting question. Does that mean that people had a reason to be Christian before Jesus? I don't know that I've heard Craig explicitly talk about that. I would expect some kind of vague answer about, well, people had a reason to be theists and a reason to believe that there would be a savior or something like that, but they wouldn't have, obviously, knowledge of specific Christian propositions. But then again, Craig has also said that God has... sorry, just background noise here. Craig has also said that God has middle knowledge, which means that he doesn't just know what people actually will choose in particular, like what they will choose in the actual world, but also God knows what they would have chosen in any alternative possible world. And Craig says that on that basis, God is justified in not saving those who are live in a circumstance where they don't know about Christianity, because God knows, well, if they were in a circumstance where they knew about Christianity, they wouldn't have accepted it anyway. That being the logic that, that God providentially ensures that that's the case. And so, I don't actually know how to fit those two arguments together. I'm sure Craig would have something to say that somehow you can fit those two together. They seem in conflict now that I think about it, but whatever. I mean, different Christians are going to say different things about exactly what the epistemic status of people who lived before Jesus was. I don't really think that you can credibly square that circle with the huge numbers of people that lived in places like China and India or the Americas before there was even a whisper of Christianity there, or even monotheism in some cases. But yeah, whatever. That's a whole other argument, I guess.
Of what they've been exposed to, whether or not they've developed defeaters to those potential defeaters that they've been given. I'm using a lot of language here, but you kind of get the idea, right? Is that it's really person relative, kind of like what you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, and this can help us be a lot kinder to other people too, rather than thinking, oh, they are irrational. I mean, we don't know what they've been exposed to. Like if somebody's grown up in a community where all the smartest people they know believe in God, they had not met an atheist yet. Let's say their parents like made it so that they were unable to read atheist literature, so they didn't even know it was out there. I mean, it's hard to say that person wouldn't be rational in believing in God. And I think we should say the flip side, and this is for any Christians watching, like some Christians are a little bit harsh on atheists, but if you're an atheist growing up in let's say secular Europe, and you've just never met anybody who's ever believed in God, and the only religious people you've ever met are like really weird and just
fundamentalist.
Yeah. And you see pictures on TV and they're like dancing in weird ways, at least weird to you. I mean, I think for such people, I think those people would be entirely rational in being atheist, given their background evidence and what they know.
Ooh, careful there. I don't know that a lot of Christians are going to like that point, but I don't know. I don't know what they would say about this.
Yeah, I think this applies beyond race and beyond religion to even to issues about race and gender and other ways in which we tend to be harsh on each other.
Yeah, okay, let's
reason for irrational beliefs. And I think what he does in this section, and again, this is just what I interpret him doing, is it seems like he's giving a sort of psychological explanation for why people maintain irrational beliefs, which is a different question. Psychology is not epistemology. There's a difference between those. But let's listen to...
Oh, is that a new slogan? Psychology is not epistemology? I haven't heard that before, but it sounds very sloganistic to me. There are some people who think that psychology... Sorry, wrong way. There are some people who think that epistemology should be reduced to psychology, or at least maybe cognitive science a bit more generally. There's a kind of a program called Epistemology Naturalized, which kind of seeks to naturalize epistemology by relating it more explicitly to science, and maybe cognitive science or biology or psychology more specifically, which I think is in its infancy these days, but it's sort of I'm quite sympathetic towards that general idea. So I don't know. I don't quite buy that slogan that epistemology is not psychology. Maybe you think it is, at least in an ideal sense. Like maybe it should be. But anyway, that's another discussion.
To this clip and then get Andrew to comment.
And of the beliefs we hold that are not rational, we typically maintain them because we haven't considered, much less even recognized, the absence of their evidential and logical support. Instead, we've leaned on intuition, authoritative figures, and cognitive bias. That said, there is a pretty...
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so... the word intuition here, what you said earlier, Cameron.
Yeah, I noticed that. He's not going to like putting intuition there with...
I do think about the word intuition, the way philosophers use it might be a little different.
Well, philosophers use the word intuition a lot, and I don't know that they theorize it very well.
If we mean by intuition just kind of how things seem to you, and we made it even we need that as a basis for knowing things like, no bachelor can be married, or nobody can be taller than themselves. I mean, we need these intuitions to know even basic things like that. And we'll probably get
hang on,
later,
what did he just say?
Stephen can be married, or we need that as a basis for knowing things like, no bachelor can be married, or nobody can be taller than themselves. I mean, we need these intuitions to know even basic things like that.
We need intuitions to know that no one can be taller than themselves. Well, maybe he's using the word intuition differently than I am, because I wouldn't call that an intuition. I mean, I would call those true by definition, and that doesn't seem to be... I mean, I guess you can say that we're using our intuition about like word meanings, but it feels relevantly different to like a trolley problem case, when whether you should pull the lever or not doesn't depend on any like semantic truth. It's not true by definition, at least not in any straightforward way. Whereas no one can be taller than themselves, or no bachelor is married. I mean, those are kind of definitionally true. At least it seems to me. So I think you can explain or justify those beliefs simply by explaining, well, here's what that word means, and then here's what you're saying, which is in direct conflict to what that definition posits. So I don't know. That doesn't seem like an intuition to me. It seems quite directly articulable. Yeah, I don't know that that's super important there, but I would push back against the idea that we sort of quote unquote need intuitions. Maybe we need them psychologically; they help us to reason, but I don't know that we need them to justify any types of belief. I mean, this is going to depend on how you think this knowledge is structured. I'm pretty skeptical about foundationalist theories of knowledge, which postulate some kind of basic beliefs or beliefs at the rock bottom of our justificatory chain that sort of grounds the whole thing. I'm pretty skeptical that such things exist. I don't know what he thinks about that. Maybe he thinks that there are such things, and maybe they're intuitions. I don't know.
And we'll probably get to this.
But I mean, the other point is, even if you think that intuition can be a source of justification, it's clearly quite unreliable in general. And so I think that it's sort of also fine to put it along with authoritative figures and cognitive biases, because a lot of people will make judgments based on intuition. They're just completely off base and they have no idea what they're talking about. And it's often fueled by cognitive bias. So I think even if you think that it can be valid sometimes, or like intuitions can be informative or even stand in justificatory relations to other beliefs, even so, there's still a lot to be said against them. So I think it's fine what
this later,
saying
but I
here.
think Stephen will need the intuition that God would never allow gratuitous evil, or that even that some instance of evil is gratuitous. I mean, we kind of have these, yeah, that seems right. It just seems right. And at some point, we're going to have to get to a stopping point to the premises of our arguments, and they're going to be supported by intuition.
Okay, so he pretty much is articulating a foundationalist view there. I guess it could be some kind of foundationalist externalism, doesn't have to be internalist, but that's not important here. Yeah, he said at some point we're going to get to a stopping point. See, that's only true if you see knowledge as kind of like a linear structure, which I've done a debate about this a couple of years ago, I guess now, about foundationalism versus coherentism. I lean towards coherentism, which rejects the idea that knowledge is fundamentally linearly structured. It's more like a web rather than a chain. I mean, some parts of it may be like a chain, right? But ultimately, it's sort of more like a web-like structure of mutual support and coherence. So I guess that's going to be a point of difference there. I don't know what Stephen thinks about this, but again, I think this is maybe reading a bit more into what the point is supposed to be here, that intuitions are often quite unreliable.
So maybe the charitable interpretation is he might mean intuition in a very specific way, and then, yeah, that's bad. If we mean like, by intuition, I just know that my team's going to win, or something like that.
Well, how is that different from any of the other examples that you gave of intuition? Like, there don't seem to be any criteria for good versus bad intuitions. And that's one of my criticisms of appealing to intuitions, is that there seem to be no criteria. And there are criteria for like using evidence well, there's criteria for using inference well. Right? We can call that like we can call that we can describe those in terms of rationality or evidence or empiricism. But in terms of intuitions, it doesn't really seem to be much in the way of criteria. It's just sort of whatever you think, right? Like, if you just have this strong intuition that your team is going to win, well, why is it not rational to believe that your team's going to win? I don't know what the criteria are there. I think that you can articulate certain criteria, but it's going to have to be based on, like, you can say when are intuitions trustworthy, but those criteria, I think, are what does the justificatory work. It's like experience or track record or something. It's not the intuition itself. Intuition is more like, it's basically the mode of presentation of a certain type of belief. It's the way that the belief is delivered to us by our cognitive processes, in that it just sort of comes to us and we're not quite sure why we think that, or we can't quite articulate it very well. At least we'd have to think about it further. That seems to be what an intuition is, right? But in and itself, the intuition isn't doing justifying. It's the criteria that we would use to assess the intuition. So I think it's just a mistake to think that intuitions do justifying in and of themselves. Beliefs that are based on intuition might be useful for justifying other beliefs, but only if they themselves can be justified through other principles or other bases. I get the sense that he'd probably disagree with that, because he would say, well, there has to be something at the base, right? And whatever principle that is or idea that is, then that has to be just taken as intuition. As I said, I would reject that. But I don't know. I think it's a bit of it's probably just overanalyzing what Stephen's trying to say here, to be honest. Yeah, well, in terms of gratuitous evil, I think we're going to get to that in a moment, or in a bit later in the video. So we'll come back to that question. All right, let's keep going.
But if we mean something a little broader in the way I've talked about,
if you're like really looking deep into a specific argument, then what you're going to find, at least what I found, is that once you get to the edges of the dialectic, which means once you've looked at like the responses to the responses to the responses to the responses, and you're like, you reach the end and there's no more responses to read. Usually when you get to that point, to that level, it almost comes down to a clash of intuitions on some very esoteric, like very minute, specific thing. And so in a lot of cases, like, and that's not just true.
I think that can be true, although I would cash that out by saying, when we say clash of intuitions, it means we haven't been able to fully articulate our reasons for disagreement or why we believe certain things. So I would call it a failure of articulation or a failure of imagination and effort, and not just, oh, well, there's no further to go here. There's nothing else to be said. We just disagree. I guess it's hard to falsify that, right? Because, whenever there's an impasse, you could just say, well, you could analyze it further, but maybe that's just the way it is. Maybe that's the way it is. But also, many of these disputes, like, most people don't actually go more than a couple of layers deep, and it gets pretty. If the number of branches increases by a factor of 2 at each layer, you get an exponential explosion pretty quickly, which makes it quite hard to actually survey the entire argument tree. If you see what I'm saying. And other branches may be relevant to your assessment of the plausibility of one particular point. So I don't know. I kind of reject this idea that you survey the whole thing and then it's just a clash of intuitions, and that explains why there's disagreement. I think that it's actually very hard to do that and have a holistic understanding of the whole argument tree. And often people haven't pursued it as far as they could, or as we could, either because they don't have the time, or they don't know where to find the resources, or simply because no one's done this yet, because it hasn't been focused on very much. Like, you would think that there would be a lot of responses to William Lane Craig's arguments, for example, and there have been to certain aspects of it in the literature. But I wrote the first book that systematically responded to all of his apologetic case for Christianity. And that's kind of ridiculous, since I'm just some dude, right? Like, no one else had done this before. Well, no one else could be bothered, or people had better things to do with their time, right? And he's actually a fairly well-known figure. So, this idea that it's all about clashing intuitions when you go to the edge, I don't know. I don't buy that. I think that a lot of it is just we haven't explored the argument space very well, or we don't have a full appreciation of it.
True of theists, like theists who want to defend an argument. It's also true of atheists who want to reject some argument. They're going to have to, well, in the case of like Alex O'Connor, he has toyed with the idea, at least, of mereological nihilism, and that's a belief, or at least a
mereological nihilism for the win.
A view about the world, which, I mean, if you think about it, when you get down to it, is going to be based on intuition, at least at some level. So,
well, I think that at some level is doing a lot of work there. I actually don't think you need to justify it by intuition at all. I think you justify it on the basis of its explanatory virtues with respect to competing theories. Of course, you could argue where do those virtues come from, and we could discuss that. But I don't know. I don't agree with Cameron here.
Yeah, I think that it's basically impossible to get away from, and we rely on these intuitions when it comes to logic, when it comes to the rules of inference, modus ponens, modus tollens, all these different rules of inference. And so it's not a bad thing, and that's not to say that it's infallible. I think that's a sort of misunderstanding that people have about intuition, is that just because you want to say some positive things about it doesn't mean that you can't say any negative things about it. You can also be a sort of fallibilist about intuition and say that sometimes it gets it right. Most of the time, I suppose it gets it right. And then there are...
Now, that's an interesting claim. How could we test the claim that most of the time our intuitions are accurate? I hear this claim made sometimes, but it seems to be obviously wrong to me. I guess you could say that's my intuition, although I would reject that and say, I don't think it's an intuition. I think it's based on my reading and assessment of the psychological evidence there. Maybe there's a bit of intuition cropping into it there as well. But I think most of our intuitions are probably wrong. Part of the issue is we often don't even formally, we don't even articulate our intuitions very often, because they kind of pop up, and most of the time we probably don't even think about them or register that they've popped up. So how do you even count them? Is it just intuitions that you think about, or anything that kind of comes to your attention at some point, or might have if you directed your attention towards it? How do you even quantify that as a claim? But I don't know. I'm very skeptical about the notion that most of our intuitions are correct. It's going to depend on how you individuate them and how you count them, and exactly what counts as an intuition, of course. But I don't know. I think the point is, if people think that that's important in terms of a reliability type argument, then that's in principle testable if we try to operationalize what an intuition is. Hard to do, but I don't know. It seems to me it should be an interesting project, right? And this is an example of this could be an example of naturalized epistemology, where you're saying, oh, our intuitions are usually reliable. It's well, okay, bro, let's test that. That's within the realm of psychology, cognitive science, in principle, to test that sort of thing. But a lot of philosophers just don't have much interest in that side of it, which I think is disappointing.
Points where you can get it wrong. And so that's why it's important to really think clearly as you can, about these difficult cases when it comes to these big metaphysical questions, like, does God exist? What are the fundamental truths? And that's what we attempt to do on Capturing Christianity, is really think hard and deep and critical about these things at a very deep level. And so we don't just take it at face value. We try to look as deep as possible and do what we can, in the sense of what we're capable of as humans. But yeah, any other thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, well, and just to emphasize, not only are intuitions or seemings fallible, as in sometimes they go wrong, but our sensory experiences are fallible too. Like our very perception is fallible. So
Well,
sometimes
this
Yeah,
is a
we
point
know
that
the
atheists
hallucination.
make all the time, right?
I might think that I saw Fred when I was really right. There's hallucinations, or I might just misread a sign. So I mean, I can already see someone typing in the YouTube comments like, "Well, I have an intuition," and like give an instance where intuition leads you astray. I mean, yeah, for any source of evidence, it could lead you astray, or pretty much any source. But that's not enough to show it's unreliable generally.
Well, hang on. I think we're shifting the goalposts here. What's the reason or evidence to show that it is reliable generally? Why are we assuming that it's reliable? I mean, I guess there are people who say that that's the appropriate, that our intuition should be kind of innocent until proven guilty. I just find that completely ridiculous. But what is the there's a word for this now that I come to think of it. It's like oh, I've forgotten. Someone will remind me in chat what the name for this position is. The idea that you should take your kind of seemings at face value until there's a reason to believe otherwise. I just think that's just an absurd view, but whatever. I think it's not the main point here. I kind of would like to get to the main issue of the video, which I think is going to be something about the problem of evil. We seem to have spent a long time talking just about definitions, which is kind of boring.
Factors that are at play that might psychologically explain why someone has an irrational belief, or say some belief. That does not entail that their belief is irrational.
Yeah, this is a good point. How do we measure the level of intuitions? What factor of an argument is attributed with the intuitions? I mean, this is part of the issue that I don't think that intuitions are well, I need to read more about this, but I don't think they're that well characterized in psychology. So I don't know that we have a very good understanding of them. I think about them as some kind of judgment that we can't really articulate our reasons for holding, or that we just sort of seem to have it. But if you ask why, we find it difficult. So, I don't know, moral, like trolley problem examples where people are like, oh, that seems wrong to me, or that seems like we should do this. But if you ask them why, they're not quite sure, they can't explain it. That's the sort of thing that I have in mind. Or some people have a strong intuition that God exists. Some have an intuition that doesn't. Some people have an intuition that there's an afterlife. Some don't, things like that. It's like, well, you can't really explain why. They just, seem to. Of course, those are big questions. There are smaller questions as well that people have intuitions about. Like I have an intuition that this way will be faster, but actually I have an intuition this way, but I can't really justify that. That's kind of what I think about intuitions, as being sort of these beliefs that we hold to and seem to have a basis for maybe, but we can't really explain or articulate why. And I think that we should be quite suspicious of them for that fact, because of that fact. But yeah, I don't know that they're that well characterized. And so I think a lot more research needs to be done on this. And until then, I think we should be kind of skeptical about appealing to them to do a lot of, shall we say, epistemic heavy lifting for us. Yeah, can we just move past this intuitions point, though? I want to get to some more substance.
Once someone realizes that their belief was formed unreliably, then they have an irrational belief. So
yeah, there's more epistemology.
and this drug makes people lose faith. That's an empirical psychological claim. But once I learn of that,
each of these is bad. Okay, you've got to establish that they're unreliable, right? If some belief is based solely on intuition, then that's unreliable. And so, but that's just one part of the equation, right? That's one part. The other part is you've got to establish that the person, the individual, they form their belief in that manner. They form their belief on the basis of intuition. So you've got to establish that. That's the sort of second component. And then the third component, I think, would be the sort of linking or conditional premise. If someone developed their belief on the basis of, say, intuition, then they would not be rational. And so that would be, I think, the sort of three components that would have to be argued in order to establish that some belief is irrational. Is that sort of what you're arguing? Or,
that would be the main
just explained?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And so
yeah, to me, it seems
the psychology to the epistemology.
Yeah, and that seems pretty difficult, actually. It seems pretty difficult to establish that someone is believing on this or that basis, and then you've also got to argue that believing on that basis is bad or unreliable. And we've already talked about intuition. So maybe this is a good point for us to go back and look at these three components that he outlines as sort of bad reasons to believe something, or rational ways of coming to a belief. So the first one is intuition. We've talked about that we agree that intuition is fallible, but that doesn't mean that it's unreliable. The second one is
true. It doesn't mean it's reliable either, right? Now, I suppose you could say, well, look, the burden of proof here is on rationality rules, because he's making an argument in this video, although they haven't let him. He's 2 minutes into a let's call it 10-minute video, and they've been talking about it for 46 minutes, and he hasn't even given an argument yet. He's basically just defined some terms and set the stage a bit in Stephen's video. Again, people say I'm long-winded, but like, usually I cover more than that. Usually, like, I'll cover a 1-hour video in like 3 hours or something like that. They've covered 2 minutes in 45 minutes. And I mean, you can say that they've talked about definitions and epistemology and stuff as well, but I kind of, because I just don't know how important that is to Stephen's argument, is the underlying issue here. I don't know that he needs to make the, I don't know that he needs to provide the justifications that they're saying that he does, because I don't know yet what his argument is going to be. I think all he's tried to say is that there are some processes for forming beliefs that are better than others. Let's leave better as sort of fairly vague, but I think we can understand that in general, that's true. Some of the good ways are good ways of forming beliefs are to use reason, evidence, logic. Some of the bad ways are to rely on intuition, authority, and cognitive biases. I don't think that should be too controversial a claim. Maybe the intuition part is a bit more controversial, depending on how you understand that. But like, it's a pretty base level stuff here. I don't know that we need to overinterpret it. Yeah, I mean, point made here by Meredith that there's a difference between different types of claims, and making an inference or forming a belief about ordinary everyday objects that are within our realm of experience is very different from forming beliefs about alleged omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent deities that are disembodied minds that allegedly, caused the universe and designed everything and so forth. Those are very, very different types of beliefs, and it's not really reasonable to make inferences directly about one to the other. Oh, I have an intuition that, my hand exists, therefore I'm also valid in informing intuitions about the existence of, the beginnings of the universe, or fine tuning, or things like that. This is basically what I regularly criticize William Lane Craig for. It's just applying the intuitions that he has on the basis of his everyday experiences of kind of ordinary sized objects in Newtonian gravity and conditions, etc., to well beyond what anyone has experience or familiarity with in terms of like the very beginning of time and space, or the fine-tuning of the laws of physics, or like the grounding of the ontological grounding of morality and things like this. It's just absurd to think that a simple extrapolation is appropriate there. But I mean, quite a few philosophers think that. I mean, there are a lot of philosophers who are skeptical about that. But unfortunately, there are still philosophers, from my point of view, who do make those sort of inferences, and you do read this in articles sometimes. So. Yeah, I think that kind of intellectual work is pretty much useless if that's all that we can appeal to is like, well, in my everyday experience, it seems this, therefore make a wild extrapolation of that. I just don't have much respect for that. I'm not saying Cameron has done that here, by the way, or the other two, but that does happen a lot, unfortunately, particularly with theists, it seems, who make these sort of appeals.
Is authoritative figures, so let's look at that one a little bit closer.
Yeah.
No, so now they're talking about authoritative figures.
Straightforward. I mean, we need authoritative figures.
Yeah, we need authoritative figures,
religion.
but you got to pick your authority as well. That's an interesting question. I just don't want to talk about it now. I just want to make some progress in the video. Yeah, look, authorities are needed, but not all authorities are equal. You should be skeptical about entirely relying on authoritative figures about things that you know literally zero about, because you do need to have some basis for why you've accepted certain authorities over others. That's one of the reasons why I think it's important for everyone to get even just a little bit of knowledge about different areas, so you can hopefully at least tell who the good authorities would be, and maybe get the vaguest sense of whether their advice they're giving you is appropriate or not. That's a broader discussion to have, but certainly in religious matters, one can't simply appeal to authoritative figures in your community. That's not going to be appropriate. But even outside of that, we should be quite cautious. Maybe a hot take, actually. Let me throw in a hot take at this point about authorities. Craig has the witness of the Holy Spirit. You can't argue with that. Well, why do you think he has it? Precisely because you can't argue with it. Hot take here. I don't like the way that the climate change debate has focused a lot on expert consensus or scientific consensus. I mean, there's something to be said about scientific consensus, and I do think that one should follow the scientific consensus. But I don't like the way that that's been approached in terms of like public communication or science communication. I think that it's a mistake to place too much emphasis on trust of authorities like that. Part of the reason is strategic, because a lot of the people who don't believe in don't believe in anthropogenic climate change also don't trust scientific or political authorities. So appealing to them is not likely to be very helpful. But the other thing is, I think epistemically, it's not really an entirely justifiable strategy. I guess you would ask, well, what's the alternative? Try to teach people climate science? Well, I don't know. I have a science podcast. I think you can communicate science to everyday people if you just take the effort to do so carefully. and I'm not saying people like no one's tried to do that, but all I'm saying with respect to climate science, but I guess the point I'm making is that even when it comes to appeals to scientific authorities, I'm still not entirely comfortable with that as a primary route or primary like public primary what am I trying to say here? Primary public communication. Like, well, the scientists believe it, so you should believe it. I think that that's not conveying the right message about the nature of science or how people should form their beliefs. At some point, of course, you're going to need to trust work that other people have done because you can't reproduce all the experiments yourselves. But there's levels there of understanding and where the trust begins. Anyway, so that's my hot take. I'm not entirely comfortable with the way that I see that portrayed as a pure trust of expertise without any understanding whatever. So I think that if we're going to make that, I guess the point is, if we're going to make that critique of trust of religious authorities or traditional authorities, it should also apply to trust of scientific authorities. Not to say that we shouldn't trust them and not to say that they're on par. The methodologies used by science is very different to those used by religious authorities, but that's part of the issue, right? Is at least to have a basic understanding of the difference in methodology. I think that's underlies some of the mistrust of science is actually some people just have, I'm not saying they don't have a good understanding of scientific methodology. I'm saying they have no understanding of scientific methodology. They actually just have no comprehension of the way that the scientific methodology is different from, let's say, religious methodology or methodology that informs many religious beliefs, at least traditional religious beliefs. And so that's kind of relevant for people to have at least a glimpse of the understanding of that. So, I mean, I kind of agree here. We should be careful about criticism of authority because we do want to appeal to authority in a lot of cases. But at the same time, we should be careful about how we perhaps put scientific authority on a pedestal sometimes and talk about it in a way which, to the uninitiated sounds a lot like religious authority. And I think that is a bit of an issue there. It's difficult to explain climate change in the most accurate ways. It's easy to gish gallop their way against it. Well, that's also true. So it depends who you're talking to. Right? I'm not saying if you're talking to the ardent denialists who actually do know something about it and can throw all the stuff back against you. It's very much audience specific. And I'm not saying that I have a clear procedure that works in all cases. All I'm saying is we should be careful about simply appealing to scientific authorities without any further basis of understanding or explanation of methodology or like anything like that. Because then when we critique religious authority or other types of traditional authorities, I think that it's harder for people to understand that distinction. Anyway, let's move beyond that.
And then we'll turn to faith. I feel like we're kind of dragging this out, but we'll go a little bit quicker here. So cognitive bias.
Yeah, 55 minutes and we're still at 2 minutes.
So let's discuss that one briefly and then we'll move on to the next clip.
Yeah, what's he got to say about cognitive bias?
I agree. I think we should be quick and we should have a lot of time for the problem of evil. So I would to say cognitive bias. I mean, bias is kind of a negative term, but if he kind of means that there's structures in our minds that lean us toward God, toward belief in God, we could just say the same things apply that we said about the other two topics. I mean, we want to know if these biases are indeed unreliable or would lead us to false beliefs or not. And then if so, we can develop a debunking argument. If not, then we can't. There's a lot of tricky waters here, but I think that would be too long to get into. So I'll probably just leave it at that.
Yeah, and one other thought I would have is that it's probably the case that we're suffering from biases that we're unaware of. And that doesn't just apply to theists. It applies to everyone who's thinking about these issues. I think we all deal with bias. And that's one of the reasons why when someone points out that someone is biased, I'm like, okay, but you're biased too. Like everyone has their own biases in their own ways. So it's almost irrelevant to point out that someone is biased. What we try to do is...
I was kind of on board with what Cameron said there. It is not irrelevant. We should constantly be pointing out other people's bias. We should be pointing out our own biases as well. But often it's easier to see in other people, the beam in the other one's eye, so to speak. But it's not irrelevant just because everyone suffers it. I don't really understand this point. This is the fact that everyone suffers bias, and I think a lot of biases, is all the more reason to point it out kind of all the time. I mean, I suppose you could go overboard, and by pointing out bias, I don't just mean like naming logical fallacies or like name dropping biases or things like that. That's not really helpful, but trying to articulate the ways in which bias affects people. Like, okay, here's an example that people like Cameron never seem to like. The fact that the atheist, and this is, I think, an asymmetry that's just like objectively true. The atheist movement, the like counter-apologetics type stuff, mostly, with only a very small number of exceptions, is done by people like me, just part-time as a hobby on the side, make little money out of it. Now compare that to the apologetic space, at least in the Christian apologetic space, but I think it's true to a lesser extent for some other religious traditions as well, is done. Sure, there's plenty of people who do it part-time, but there's a lot of people who do it full-time and or who are paid to do it and or who like study whole degrees in it and there are whole universities that focus on it and have courses in it, not just pastors, but also like the popular apologists. And then there's academics who spend their whole lives, like Craig, trying to defend Christianity. There's a massive asymmetry there. In other words, in terms of the amount of resources and the institutionalization and other things like creeds of faith and other faith creeds and things like that have to be signed at many of these institutions, people's livelihoods and whole communities depending on this in a way that is very rarely the case for atheist activism or counter-apologetics. That is, I think, a huge source of bias that should be obvious to anyone. It doesn't automatically negate the arguments of apologists, of course. They still need to be addressed, but it's a big factor. And if this was a scientific issue, or if it was a political issue, or if it was, like a business transaction that had where parties had these sort of conflicts of interests, then anyone would recognize that, this source of bias is potentially like important, right? But somehow it's just like apologists just brush away, like, this doesn't matter. Everyone's biased. Shut up. Like, stop talking about the money and the fact that our livelihoods depend on this, and we've signed faith creeds and all this other stuff. Like, it's just an evasion as far as I'm concerned. That bias is completely that much of apologetics is saturated with bias because a lot of it is self-justification and doing what their job is to do, which is to defend the faith, which is what literally supports them because that's their job. There's just much less of this in the atheist space. And again, I know there are a few examples of people who do that you can mention, but proportionally, it's nowhere close. And I think that the point here is that to say, everyone's biased is to really dodge the issue. First of all, yeah, and that everyone is biased, and so that's why it's important to talk about. But second of all, not all biases affect different sides equally. Perhaps there's biases that affect atheists more. I'm open to that. But I think that there's just one very obvious one, or one set of biases, which just clearly affects the Christian apologists way, way, way more than it does atheists and counter apologists. And mostly they kind of refuse to acknowledge it, which I just think is super lame. And so I think it's absolutely appropriate to be pointing this out and pointing out bias more generally.
Eliminate the bias as much as possible through critical thinking. And as long as I think that you're putting effort into that, that's the best that we can do. Doesn't mean that we're going to eliminate bias, but it just means that we're at least aware of it and trying to mitigate it as much as possible. So that's all I'll say. Let's go ahead and move on to the next clip, which is starting at 2:05, I believe, right about here. And this one has to do with faith. So he gives a definition of faith. We're actually still in the very beginning part of this video, and we're already an hour in. But this is just where he's setting things up and giving definitions. And it's really important actually to focus on the definitions, because if the definitions are problematic, then what that's going to mean is that the conclusion that he wants to arrive at, that theism is irrational, it may not follow if we find problems earlier on in the way that the whole thing is set up. So that's why it's important to focus on these things.
I mean, to an extent, I think that in a philosophical argument, it's usually best to accept your interlocutor's definitions. Now, sometimes they might be mutually in conflict or something like that, so you do need to discuss them. But I mean, this is the classic critique of philosophy, right? It's just that it's all arguing about the definitions of words, which, I mean, it's too often true. I don't think it's always true, but I think there were some interesting points about epistemology and authority and other things that we discussed. That was kind of interesting. But honestly, a lot of this has very little to do with Stephen's video, because I don't actually think he's making any claims about epistemology or other things that are very substantial. I think all he's trying to do is set up the dichotomy between good types of reasoning and bad types of reasoning, or good reasons for belief and bad reasons for belief. And he's sort of loosely putting evidence and reason and logic in one, and intuition, authority, and cognitive bias in the other. I don't really think that should be particularly controversial at the level of detail or sophistication that the argument is operating at. So I think most of this first hour, although there were some interesting points in there, is not really important. Maybe I'll be proven wrong if there's some element of Stephen's argument that turns on a particular definition he's given. But I kind of doubt that. I don't know. I mean, they can respond to whoever they like, but I just think it's oddly skewed to spend like half of their response, I assume there's maybe a few questions, half of their response on the first 2 minutes of just pretty bland definitions. Also, why is this guy here? Like, I guess he's going to do the problem of evil part, but he's just been like saying nothing for an hour. I don't know. It's weird to have someone who just sits there for an hour, but whatever, you do.
So let's now play the clip, and then we'll
this person has really short arms, by the way. I just noticed. Like, look at that. Those are some shrimpy arms. Or are they wearing a jacket that don't have, because like, where are their hands? Because their hands would be like here, which means their arms are like even short. This is AI. This is AI art, right? It's you get some weird stuff. Anyway,
on faith.
That said, there is a pretty famous other way of maintaining irrational beliefs that some even venerate, namely faith. Per Hebrews 11, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. To have faith is to believe in a proposition despite there not being sufficient evidence for doing so. So there's our keywords front and center.
All right. Yeah, and again, he's saying that there's all the keywords, there's the definitions of words and everything. Now we're about to jump into the juicy parts. So the juicy parts are coming. Just stick around. We're going to talk about this definition of faith, which it's like it didn't really make sense to me for why he brought up faith in the first place and gave it this definition that he did, because he doesn't really. It's not like central to the rest of the video. Like he doesn't even bring it up in the rest of the video. So it was strange to me that he even defined faith at all in the video.
One strange thing is he takes the Hebrews verse, substance things so for, evidence of things not seen. And then he gives a definition that doesn't at all match what the verse is saying. Like it was kind of odd. I mean, I'm not sure actually what to think of that verse. But his definition, to have faith is to believe in a proposition despite there not being sufficient evidence for doing so. The word sufficient is a little unclear. I think he means despite there not being sufficient evidence for rational belief, I guess. And so a quick thing, I mean, almost everybody working on faith now thinks that there can be such a thing as rational faith. That does include rational belief. You know, you can have there could be a lot of evidence pointing to your sports team winning, and you can have faith that your team will win, or you might have faith in your.
You know, I used to care about this issue about faith, but I just can't bring myself to talk about faith. Now, it all comes down to what you want to pack into the word faith. Let me just say that the way that I hear many Christians use the word faith is exactly how Stephen is talking about it. It's basically when you believe something despite there being insufficient rational or insufficient rational justification or insufficient evidence for it. I know that's not the way that the theologians or the apologists like to define faith. That is the way I think it's commonly used, and I think that's the way that Stephen's appealing to it here. Now, you know, maybe he could have been a bit more sophisticated in the way he presented that, but I don't know. The level of this video, I'm inclined not to be super critical about that. And I think that Christian apologists are just such enablers about this. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them. They're just like, when atheists criticize the concept of faith, they get super defensive and give these fairly elaborate schemes for understanding what faith is, many of which have no bearing on the way that the term is actually used by most Christians, in which case, well, like, who even cares? Like, just so that you can, I guess this is true for a lot of religious beliefs, I suppose, and interpreting the Bible and such, but especially for something like faith that has been the subject for a lot of targeted criticism by atheists and rationalists for centuries now, since the Enlightenment particularly. I think that what they really should try to do is rescue or is interrogate the everyday practices of Christians using the term faith and see how well that actually fits in with their preferred philosophical readings. Because it seems to me that the conceptions that are given by philosophers or theologians or whatever, or apologists, just break too much with the everyday usage of it to really be accounts of the same concept. You know, could be wrong there, but that's what always annoys me about this, that they just want to have their discussion about how to understand the notion of faith completely separately from how Christians actually talk about it, which renders the whole issue kind of pointless, right? Because we're kind of interested in actually understanding what Christians believe and how they think about these things. These pencils in this cup are really annoying me here. Is it just me, or does it feel like that's too top heavy? Like the length at which the pencils protrude feels like that they would be heavy enough such that they would tip over. I mean, I guess they're kind of pointing in opposite directions. I'm using my physical intuition here to try to reason about whether that would be. It doesn't look stable to me. It looks like they're not on enough of an angle to like be set up against the edge here. I guess there could be like, I mean, theoretically there could be like blue tacked down or something like that. I don't know. It looks they look too tall to me. Is it just me, or does this book has two, look at this, this book has two different bindings. There's a binding here, and then there's a binding here. It's like a quad book. That's so cool. I didn't notice that before. This is what you get with AI art, man. Like, it looks okay look at this. Look at the curtain here. I guess there could be a window over here, though that would be a bit of a strange room, and it doesn't look like there's a window. It looks like there's a cupboard or something. There's a curtain here implying that there's a window there, but then there's a curtain here for this window. This is a strange setup. Anyway, what I was saying, AI art, like, it looks fine at a glance, but if you look at it in more detail, like, it's sort of everything is nonsense. Maybe there's a lesson there at best. I mean, you know, there's other things like this doesn't line up at the back here, but maybe there's a lesson there about apologetics, looking at closely.
And we'll start with the worm in
reveal the
Adam's apple,
problems.
the problem of evil. By virtue of God being all-powerful, we know that he can prevent evil. And by virtue of him being all-loving, we know that he wants to prevent evil. And yet, when we stroll through the remains of mass extinctions and witness natural disasters, predation, parasitic diseases, and other forms of suffering in the world, it appears obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that we're beset by gratuitous evil. That is, evil that does not serve any greater purpose or lead to any greater good. This poses a significant problem for all.
Sorry, I needed to pause it there. So maybe, Perry, is there anything you'd like to say before we play the next clip, or should I just play it?
You can just play the next one.
Generous.
Getting there in the playhead. Here we go.
To really get this on the table, let's consider a few more instances of what appears to be gratuitous evil. Leukemia in children, forest fires that incinerate wildlife, infectious diseases such as malaria, smallpox, and HIV, birth defects that often deform and cripple an animal's capacity to survive. Then we have predators.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about that last wording there. Birth defects that often deform and cripple. I feel like that could do with rewording. You don't want to say birth defects that often deform, but that's a real nitpick. I pick at things like that.
Such as lions, crocodiles, and snakes that must.
Oh, so I'm sort of fascinated by this AI art. I haven't used it much
that often
myself.
deform and cripple an animal's capacity to survive. Then we have predators such as lions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there was a leg there, and then because I'm like this wolf has. This is one of these deformed animals because it's like got 3 legs, but there was a leg there that disappeared. But this one here only seems to have 2 legs. Oh, maybe is that a leg there?
Crocodiles.
I don't know.
And snakes.
It's definitely over into. Wait, was it? It looked like a bit of the jaw turned into a leg there. This AI art stuff is fascinating.
I repeat, must.
You just spend a day like trying to understand what bits are what and how they morph into each other.
Inflict untold horrors on other sentient beings to survive. These predators are designed through.
Wait, did it turn into? It's turned into a horse. Look, that's clearly a. But what's this? Like, is that the tail or
evolution or creation to do this?
Look, the head and the end are flipping. I'm getting way too invested in this. That is clearly a 5th leg, by the way.
This isn't a bug. It's a feature. God gave them their weapons and ensured that they must use them on the innocent. And what about parasites such as ticks, fleas, and tapeworms, with the life cycle of some consisting of eating their host from the inside out? These teleological evils, we're told, must be for the best somehow. To believe this.
Okay, to believe this, I argue, is to be profoundly irrational. That's what he was going to conclude there. Perry.
Okay. So yeah, there's.
So I suspect that they're going to talk about this problem of evil thing for the rest of the hour of their video, and I don't really intend to review all of that. So I'm just sort of debating. How long have we gone for? An hour and a half? Maybe we can do another half hour of coverage through stuff. Oh, geez, that looked awful. Fire and brimstone. Well, we'll see how we go. Maybe we'll skip around a bit.
I don't know if these are nitpicky, but a few things to start with on how we're defining gratuitous evil. So one that's nitpicky that I won't go into is that we should really be focusing on whether the permission of the evil is gratuitous, not whether the evil itself is gratuitous. That's what philosophers are typically focused on. Yeah. And so really, we should, like I said, be focusing on whether the permission we should really be focusing on whether the permission of the evil is gratuitous, not whether the evil itself is gratuitous. That's what philosophers are typically focused on.
The permission of the evil. So God allowing the evil, as opposed to. I'm not sure I understand the distinction.
And so really, we should, like I said, be focusing on whether the permission of the evil is gratuitous. But secondly, there's this other kind of thing going on there is he doesn't state it strong enough. He can make his argument stronger by saying that the evil, it can't just produce the greater good. It's got to be required for or necessary for the good to, or set of goods to be to obtain, right? But that also leaves out the second half of what gratuitous evil is. And I suspect he could have just left this out due to time constraints or whatever. But, so for an evil to be gratuitous, in addition to it not being required for a greater good or set of goods that outweighs it, its prevention also can't, it also has to be false that its prevention.
This is boring.
Any greater good. Yeah, and so what you're saying is that this is only part of what it means, at least in the literature, what it means to be gratuitous. So there's also this doesn't prevent or go ahead.
Yeah. And yeah, he could have just left it out for time constraints, but I'm also making it stronger, right? Because the evil has to be necessary, and I'm just going to say that.
Yeah, it has to be necessary. It's kind of obvious to me.
So and we can conclude, therefore, that God doesn't exist. Now, I'll talk about the first premise later, whether...
See, I think that he should call himself a philosopher specializing in evil. That sounds way cooler than problem of evil. Shouldn't it be the problem of evil? Just say philosopher. Like, what's your field? I study evil. I think that's way cooler.
God's existence is actually incompatible with gratuitous evil, or whether there's good reason to think that. So let's grant that for the sake of argument. Then what's the deal with the second premise, right? Like, why should we think that there's gratuitous evil? Well, we're told that it's obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that there's this gratuitous evil, right? And so it sounds like he's saying that it's intuitive. It sounds like the argument is supposed to be that it's really intuitive that there's gratuitous evil.
Yeah, I think that that's going to be a problem in this video because he did place Stephen did place intuition in the category of unreliable inferences, and now he's sort of saying it's obvious. Now, they have only gone like not even halfway through the video, so maybe he articulates this further. One of the problems with making the argument, this kind of argument about gratuitous evil, is that the conclusion here is about absences, right? So the idea is that we should reason that we should infer that there is no reason or justification or greater purpose behind certain evils. But because the conclusion is about there not being something, you can't have sort of definitive proof of the non-existence of something, right? Unless you can prove that it's logically contradictory, which is not the objection here. It's not the object here. So it's sort of quite hard to be definitive about when you should not believe something that exists. I think that a better way to frame the argument is probably that there have been many attempts to articulate what the justifications for these sorts of evils would be, and none of them have been successful. That should mitigate us against believing that there are any. And furthermore, we also act in human society as if these are evils that don't have any greater purpose that we should overcome. So we try to cure, leukemia and birth defects and things like that, right? We try to overcome these. Our actions take for granted that these are not actually good in disguise, right? That they're actually bad, that they're bad, in fact, bad things on balance, and that they should be overcome or removed or, eliminated. So I think if you combine those things, like a lack of ability to explain them and us taking it as sort of for granted, or as taking it as a premise of our actions to overcome them, that these are in fact bad things. On that basis, I think you can argue that it's reasonable to think that there are not in fact good reasons for God allowing these, that they are in fact just bad, on balance bad. And if they are in fact on balance bad and there is no reason for allowing them, then it seems to imply that God doesn't exist, because if he did exist, then he wouldn't have allowed them. Of course, there are other ways around that don't try to say that each evil situation does have a greater purpose behind it. And I mean, not all theists agree with that, but those who do seem to be saddled with this problem that we seem to act on the basis of as if these things are bad, but then when we think about God, we actually say that no, they're actually good, at least overall. Maybe they're not good in and of themselves, but overall they're good. Like leukemia in kids is not maybe good in and of itself, but it's good overall that the world includes that. Why? Well, it must be if God put it there or allowed it to be there, right? Seems like a pretty strange inference to make, and it raises questions about why we bother trying to get rid of leukemia in kids. I know that Cameron's take on this is that the fact that we can make efforts to overcome them and cure leukemia in kids is actually morally better than a world in which there simply isn't leukemia in kids, which is a rather, let's say, odd view from my point of view, but I'm jumping the gun a bit here. Anyway, I guess the point is, I don't think that it's good to make this the argument about gratuitous evils and appeal to intuition, precisely because intuitions aren't very reliable. And Stephen has already said earlier in the video that intuitions are kind of a bad reason for believing things. And so if he's going to justify gratuitous evils as just being obvious, which sounds a lot like an appeal to intuition, then I think he's going to run into trouble there. I think he needs to present it in a way that doesn't appeal to it being obvious, particularly because it's not going to be obvious to a lot of theists, or even, either it won't be obvious or that at least they won't admit that it's obvious. Although in a sense, I do agree that it's obvious, but I don't think that that's kind of a sufficient justification. That's a starting point, right? We're like, this seems kind of weird. Like, why would God allow this? Let's think about this. Anyway. I studied Doofenshmirtz Evil Incorporated. Yeah, we should get that on a t-shirt. Yeah, I think that when Stephen says it's obvious, he is saying that it serves no greater purpose and there's no rational explanation for it. The trouble is, it's very hard to establish that there's no explanation for something because you might simply not have thought of it. So I think you have to run an argument like, well, here are all the proposals. Well, you can't literally list all of them, but like there have been lots of proposals. None of them have been widely successful. And they all have major problems. Therefore, we should be skeptical about thinking there are any. And furthermore, we act as if there isn't any good reason for them when we try to eradicate them. No Christian that I've ever heard about says, well, why are we curing leukemia in kids? God put it there for a reason. So, we should, although there were some crazy Christians almost saying that about coronavirus. But anyway, I guess that's another issue. I think that's a better angle to go at. But, there's different ways of making this argument. Another way to do it is to simply take it as a premise, like to take a specific example. This is how I've seen it done, like leukemia in children, and simply assert as a premise that overall, it is bad that children get leukemia. And maybe you could reframe the wording exactly, but you want to make it so that the theist who thinks that all evils are ultimately serve a greater purpose cannot agree with the premise. So you'd say something like, all things considered, it is objectively bad that children do get or can get leukemia or something like that. Speaking overall or considering all things or whatever. And it seems like the theist who thinks that evils all serve some greater purpose can't agree with that, because they're going to say, well, it's bad in and of itself, but it serves a greater purpose. And so all things considered, it's actually good, or at best neutral, although probably you'd say it's good, right? Because there has to be something to justify the suffering. So, and the point of that is that the theist can then just say, I reject the first premise. But what you can do strategically is to show, look, this is what the theist has to reject in order to defend their belief in God, right? They have to reject a premise which seems pretty crazy to reject. So I think that can be useful as a dialectical move. I think that you do kind of have to justify the premises a bit deeper than that, but it can be useful to draw out the implications of the views of certain theists. That not all theists think this, right? But I think Cameron does, that they actually seem to think that everything that is actually horrible and evil in the world is actually good. I guess this bizarre inversion of morality where it's evil things are actually good. They may not intrinsically be good. They're not good in and of themselves, but their existence, their presence in the world is actually good because it allows us to overcome them and, show courage and other virtues and things like that. Which raises the question as to why God doesn't pack even more evils in the world, and why heaven is supposed to be such a great place when presumably these evils won't exist in heaven. And it raises questions about how God can be all good. He can be the epitome of good when presumably he doesn't exhibit or suffer from these types of evils. So this is what I mean by it just completely inverts the idea of good and bad by saying, actually, lots of evil is good. Lots of evil is good because it allows us to overcome that evil. I just think that's a complete confusion. But I think this is where you end up, and drawing out that tension is, I think, should be one of the goals, or could be one of the goals of this type of argumentation. But to do that, you have to be very careful about how you formulate the argument. Anyway, there's just some thoughts on that.
And I think what's going on here, this strikes me as not a good reason, even if it is intuitive to think that there's gratuitous evil. It strikes me as a pretty bad reason to think that there is gratuitous evil. Because when we talk about gratuitous evil, it's really masking a complex concept, because as I just laid it out there, we're thinking about whether this evil is, whether it's, let's say, logically connected. Let's say that if the evil was required or necessary for the avoiding another evil, or if it was required or necessary for producing a greater good, let's say it's logically connected to that good and that evil. So whether an evil is gratuitous is a function of the value of all the goods and evils and the prevention of evils that are logically connected to it and its prevention.
Okay, so this is exactly what I mean right now. I know I've used some technical language in this discussion. I try to make things accessible. I take tangents sometimes. What I try to avoid is this sort of language that you just heard. Let me rewind a little bit there.
Let's say it's logically connected to that good and that evil. So whether an evil is gratuitous is a function of the value of all the goods and evils and the prevention of evils that are logically connected to it and its prevention, right?
Whether an evil is gratuitous is a function of all of the evils and something that its prevention is logically connected to. I can't remember the whole phrasing, but that's such a complicated and intricate framing of things, a function of this and that and logical connections. I'm having trouble keeping it straight, and I think you can bet that most people are completely lost by what you're talking about. But the point, I mean, maybe there's a place for that in a philosophy journal, but I just don't think it's helpful in this sort of conversation. It's really hard to understand what he's saying and to link that back to what Stephen's point is. And the issue I really have with this is that apologists always want to do this. They always want to take something that is it's not necessarily simple, but they want to take an initially straightforward or reasonably straightforward idea and make it as complicated and multi-layered and intricate as possible, because then no one can understand it. And basically the purpose of that is plausible deniability, because it's basically that the Christians listening to this and their kind of eyes glaze over as soon as they hear that guy talk. And all they really take out of it, oh, it's okay, I don't have to worry about gratuitous evils because, I don't know, function of something, whatever smart guy has said, it's fine, watch something else now. It's kind of this intellectual shield against criticism by just making it super complicated and intricate, that people who are Christians or lean in that direction feel kind of that there's some intellectual defense against this, and that, oh, it's much more complicated and smart people have thought about this, and also people who are raising the objection or who have doubts feel like that they're being stonewalled in that they have this sense that, these evils don't seem like they're well justified, but then someone says this and, they're like, I don't, they don't really understand. And they sort of, it's an intimidation tactic effectively. So I really dislike this. Certainly when we're talking about responding to popular videos like this, by then just using all of this jargon and convoluted sentence structure there. The question is fundamentally, do we have a reason to think that, let's say, leukemia in children serves a greater purpose, or like it exists for some ultimate benefit? That's really what it comes down to in fairly plain English. And if you think that there is a greater purpose, I guess the question is, well, what? let's hear that articulated. And does it make any sense? And I think the point of the atheist is none of these greater purposes make a lick of sense, especially when viewed in the light of an omnipotent, omniscient deity. And so there just isn't a good reason for thinking that there is any greater purpose there. That's what it comes down to. Now, you can, there's a place for making that more precise and looking at technical aspects, but I don't know. I don't know that place is here. And certainly it's not in Stephen's video. He's certainly not trying to do that. And it just really annoys me when people use philosophy like this. That it's to obscure rather than to clarify. By the way, I'm not even saying that this guy's doing it deliberately. I think that it's almost like an infection that people who study philosophy too much, and especially who focus on philosophy, just kind of, maybe not everyone, but there's a tendency to just kind of lose contact with ordinary people. I mean, I guess I've lost contact with ordinary people to some extent as well, but maybe in a different way to which the sort of philosophy junkies tend to, and they can't say anything but without talking about like propositions and something being a function of something else. Anyway. So let's see where he goes with this.
So in order to see whether this is likely gratuitous, we need to know something about all the goods and evils logically connected to it, and we need to sort of tally them up. But when you think about it that way, when you actually understand what a gratuitous evil is, that's pretty nuts to say like it's obvious that it's gratuitous, because for it to be obvious, like for it to be intuitive, you're saying it's intuitive that like when we tally up all the weights of all the goods and evils logically connected to it, that it's going to come out in kind of a net negative. It's going to be overall bad or whatever.
This is a really strange. I thought he was going to say that it's hypocritical for Stephen to appeal to intuition here, because he criticized that earlier, and I think that's actually a good argument. But here he's actually saying it's not obvious that, I don't know, leukemia in kids is on balance and overall bad, because in order to make that judgment, you have to tally up like different goods and evils that are connected to it. To me, well, I'm going to say that it's sort of obvious that's wrong, but to me, this just seems so silly that I don't know why anyone would take this seriously, right? So if I see someone, I don't know, I'm walking along the street and someone is crossing the road, and they're listening to their iPhone too, with the headphones up too loud, and they don't hear the car that's about to hit them. And well, I guess I put myself in a bind here, because how do I get their attention? Maybe I can wave at them, or maybe I can yell loud enough that they hear me even over their music. I don't know. Now, the point is, I don't actually know what the consequences of that action is going to be in terms of like how it relates to all other possible like states of affairs and what this person will do afterwards. And maybe if they died, then that would prevent some other thing. Like, I don't actually know all of that, but I think most people would agree I'm pretty well justified in saying I should warn that person to save their life. And if I were to stand there and say and not do anything, I wouldn't be justified in that on the grounds that, well, actually, I'm not really justified in making the claim that saving this person's life was on balance good. I didn't have access to enough of the functions of whatever that's logically blah 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 in order to make this assessment. That would just be ridiculous, and no one would ever take you seriously. Likewise, with all sorts of other examples, that's just one that would occur to me. Like, kids suffering from leukemia. I actually don't know how treatable leukemia is in kids, but like a condition that's treatable. And you're like, well, doctor, let's treat them. Like, well, I don't know all the moral consequences of treating them, so I don't know what we should do. No one takes those types of lines very seriously. Of course, there are some moral dilemmas where we think about like, pros and cons, but many cases we kind of don't. And I think rightly so, because we see very clearly what one line of consequences would be, and we see very clearly how bad that is. And basically, other potential outcomes don't have any countervailing obvious reasons as to why they would be sufficiently bad. So I think I don't know, there's different ways of articulating this. You could talk about, we apply a parody kind of argument that, well, maybe there could be unforeseen badness to letting them live, but maybe there's unforeseen badness to letting them die, and there doesn't seem to be a good reason for favoring one over the other, so they kind of cancel out with some kind of symmetry argument. There's different ways of articulating exactly what we're doing there, but it's a fundamentally basic point that so much of the moral action that we take, we do so not with very much knowledge about the overall like state of the universe consequences of what we do, but still with, I would argue lots of justification that that's still the right action to take. And if anyone takes any moral action that they think is morally justified, I think they're committed to that. Maybe the exception would be if you're a Christian who only thinks that you can be justified in acting morally on the basis of following God's commandments. So the justification for saving the child's life would be not that you think that it is likely to be better overall or anything else other than, well, that's what God told me to do. I think that there are problems with that as well, but that might be the one way around this. That's a pretty strong version of like a divine command theory grounding there. But unless you take that route, you have to say that we're using we're making this kind of judgments all the time when we make moral judgments. In which case, how can then it's like we act morally and make these judgments all the time, and apparently there's no great issue, at least in the majority of cases. But then when we think about, what about God morally acting? Like, why does he allow this? Somehow the rules all change. It's like, no, you can't make these judgments, man. You don't know about all the factors. I mean, I didn't know about them when I was just making ordinary moral judgments, and that, like, most people don't seem to think that's a problem. But then somehow, as soon as God comes into the picture, oh, no, you can't make that inference. Like, you don't know. Like, what are you talking about? We always make those sort of inferences. Like, should we not cure a disease? Should we not save people who are crossing roads and can easily be saved? Like, because we don't know all of the consequences. I just find this really bizarre. As a way of reasoning morally, it seems to be one rule for us and a different rule for God. And maybe you want to say that's actually should be the case because God's like above us or something, or God's our creator and has different moral situation than us. But then I don't think you can say God is all good, because how can that word have anything like the same meaning if God is like it transcends morality in some way? Well, how is he good then? If that word applies to our actions and it also applies maximally to God, then there has to be a relevant continuity of our moral standing and actions and God's moral standing and actions, presumably. Otherwise, he's not good in the same sense we are. He's like something else, right? He's just completely transcendent and beyond. So if you're going to say God is good and is a moral exemplar and these other factors, and especially if you're a Christian who believes in the incarnation, that Jesus' moral example in his earthly life is something to follow, I just don't think you can get around that. You have to say that God is good in the same sense that we are, which means that there's a kind of continuity, morally speaking, between Jesus and his life and God's moral character and our moral actions, in which case I don't understand how you can say we should cure the disease in kids because it's sort of pretty obvious that that's better than letting them die, even though we don't fully know all of the alternatives. You make that inference, but then say, oh, well, no, we don't know if God should do that. Like, I mean, who knows what factors we have to consider? It's just blatant double standards as far as I'm concerned. And I'm really surprised that he would push that line because it seems to make all moral practice impossible unless you're literally just like, well, it says in the Bible and I don't have no other basis for doing anything, but it says so in the Bible, so I just do that. I think that's a pretty flimsy basis for morality. But I think that's
how could that be something that strikes you as immediately obvious? That'd be really weird, right? Like, it'd be kind of like if, you were standing in front of Mount Baker and you said, hey, Perry, it's really, really obvious. It's intuitive that Mount Baker is the tallest mountain in Washington, right? That'd be really weird because it depends whether Mount Baker is the tallest mountain in Washington depends on other mountains in Washington and so on. It depends on the results of the search when you look at all the mountains in Washington to see which one's tallest. Similarly, like, you got to actually add up the goods and evils that are logically connected to evil to know whether it's gratuitous, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it does.
So yeah, I think that if there's an appeal to intuition,
he doesn't seem very confident there.
Here, it's a really it's an unjustified intuition. I'm skeptical that anyone actually has these kinds of intuition. But
I don't know if we'd be talking past each other there, because I'm skeptical that anyone doesn't have an intuition that, let's say, saving the life of the person who's walking across the road or treating the easily treatable disease in the children is not just sort of clearly the right thing to do in ordinary circumstances. And no one makes this argument. Like, I know people argue like, should you kill baby Hitler? But that's only because you know that it's baby Hitler. Like, most babies don't turn into Hitler, like is sort of the point of that thought experiment. But outside of something like that, no one actually takes this very seriously, the idea that, yeah, but hypothetically this could actually be a bad thing to do, right? If a certain series of connected events connect to each other. Like, here's another example. Hitler actually survived multiple assassination attempts. It's kind of crazy, actually. He seems to have gotten quite lucky. And, ordinarily you might, let's say assassination attempts that happened earlier on before anyone really knew who he was. Ordinarily you might say, oh, well, it was good that he was pushed out of the way so that the assassin didn't succeed. But maybe in that particular case, if you knew what was going to happen afterwards, you might have said, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't have said, maybe like it's on net better to, it's maybe not good to assassinate someone, but given if we somehow knew what would happen, it would be. So like you can make those judgments, but only ex post typically. And usually it's very extreme cases where we would think, yeah, actually it would have been better to do the thing that ordinarily would be bad, or allow that to happen, because we can sort of see after the fact that something really bad ended up happening. But the point is, we normally don't worry about that, and rightly so, because again, it's sort of fairly clear from everyday morality that those are very much the exceptions. And in a vast majority of these cases, it's extremely clear what to do. I don't really understand how you can justify those types of ordinary moral inferences if you think that in order to make any type of judgment like that, you have to actually consider all of these range of possibilities. I think all you have to do is have some plausible heuristic for not considering those, like the fact that there's no particular reason to think that there would be more harm caused to that person or other people by saving them versus not saving them. So there's a sort of a symmetry there. I'm just going to discard those because I know virtually nothing about them, and they seem to weigh equally on both sides. The salient reasons that I have before me are that if I save them, then that's a life saved. If I don't save them, then that's a life taken, and there don't seem to be anything else significant on the table there. Again, we're talking about easy wins here, like easy saving someone's life or treating a disease, not talking about the morally hard cases. In those cases, it seems that we can use fairly well justifiable heuristics to trim away all of the sort of extraneous uncertainty that doesn't really feature into the problem very much, and just focus on the morally salient features. But what we're getting here is somehow that we're not allowed to use any of those types of reasoning, or if we are, it's only in the case of everyday moral practice, and somehow we're not allowed to apply those reasonings to God. And I think that's basically just because Christians are okay. This is maybe being a bit uncharitable. Christians are just kind of okay with having double standards when it comes to God. It's like you make one type of inference in ordinary cases, but a different type when it comes to God. You make one type of inference with respect to other religions, but a different type of inference with respect to Christianity, with regard to like miracle claims or the resurrection or stuff like that. You make one type of inference with respect to other books, but a different with respect to the Bible. It's double standards we see across the board with apologists. And I think that this is kind of similar to that as well. It's an inability to see that this is a double standard, holding certain types of judgments up to a very high bar of evidence, even though we never do that with respect to these judgments in other contexts. And so that's how I would, that's sort of why I also favor framing the argument as about just an extension of everyday moral reasoning. Like if you reason about God's moral status the same way that we reason about everyday moral situations, you would have to conclude either that God doesn't exist or that he's an asshole. Like that's essentially the line of reasoning. Because if anyone else was in the position God was, you would make that inference about them, given all of the things that they allow. And I think that perhaps that's what Stephen is getting at when he says that it's outrageously obvious, or whatever the phrase was. But I think that probably does require a bit more unpacking, given his critique of the intuition point there. So I'm just having a quick look at chat
but
there.
If people do, it seems like it's pretty clearly unjustified. Like I think that we have reason to think to doubt that our intuitions would reliably track these logical connections and tally them up reliably as well.
Yeah, well, this is important. Let me just kind of break down what you just said. So there's basically two components. Help me with the second one to get it correctly. But the first component of a gratuitous evil is that there's no greater good.
Yeah, I mean, I can't be bothered tracking that more. I feel like it's probably going to meet diminishing returns. I'm just going to have a quick.
What you're doing is you're saying that this particular intuition, because it's about something so specific, and there's other reasons to think that it's dubious, but you're basically saying that this particular intuition is unreliable. But
yeah, I think I've already talked about that. I don't think you have to frame it as intuition. You probably shouldn't in this context. And also, I think it's just a direct extension of ordinary, everyday, moral type inferences, or inferences about other people's characters, right? If you saw someone on the street who, I don't know, there's a bunch of children who are walking across the road and a bus comes and they're not paying attention or they can't see it, and instead of warning them, he just lets them be run over by the bus. You'd probably think that dude, I mean, maybe you think, is he blind? Like, can he actually not see? And let's suppose that you learned that he could see and he did notice and all that other stuff. Like, you'd pretty much have to infer that this guy is just some kind of prick, right? Or I don't know, he temporarily went insane or something. Like, what would you conclude if something like that happened? That's just such bizarre behavior that either there's something deeply wrong with the person or they're just like a horrible person. So I don't understand why we don't make the same inferences about God. Now, I guess the difference there is that the point is, that does God exist? But perhaps here's a better way to think about it. Don't think about it as an argument against God existing, because I don't actually think it is, right? evil is not an argument against God existing, contingent on how we define God. Let's frame it in terms of it's an inference about the nature of God's character, if there is such a God. Defining God as like a creator and an originator and sustainer of the universe or whatever, not building in the omnibenevolent property for the moment. And the idea being that, suppose for the sake of argument that such a being exists, what can we infer about their character? You look at the world and you see the equivalent of God letting children be run over by buses, just like thousands every day, and even actually worse than that, because getting run over by a bus is probably a quick death versus the type of horrific suffering that's inflicted on many people and animals on Earth, let alone maybe elsewhere in the universe. So I think that if you do think that if we do stipulate that there is an omnipotent and omniscient God that's behind this, if we apply the same types of inferential rules that we apply in the ordinary everyday case, appealing to other people's characters, we got to infer that this God is either malicious or indifferent. And I actually prefer indifference because I think that explains some other aspects of the world better. But I don't know how you could justify saying that this God is benevolent when we see all of these things. But I mean, that's what's being claimed in this video is the more restrained claim that we can't really conclude anything. That's what theists often like to say. I just don't understand how they make ordinary everyday moral inferences. It seems that exactly the same rules would have us infer that the creator and sustainer of the universe, if there is one, is a prick. Now, you could, of course, say, well, the guy who let the children be run over by the bus might have a really, really good reason. It's pretty hard to imagine what that might be. But if I'm really creative, I can come up with some excuses. But like maybe he just saw those children run through a toxic waste dump and get infected with a super rare disease, which he knows they will spread to their families and kill even more people. And so he can't really do anything else. I don't know, for some reasons. The only thing he can do is let them be run over by this bus. I mean, even as I say, there's holes in this. Maybe you could tighten it up better if you're a bit more creative. The point is, there's not a logical proof there. It is possible that you could have good reasons for letting kids be run over by a bus, right? I mean, an example would be, well, actually, there was even more kids that, could have been run over. And if like the trolley problem type of example, there was an even bigger group of kids, which if the bus had swerved, it would have hit them. Although it seems like that should be obvious if we were actually at the situation. So, you can come up with other things like that. But in terms of how much you want to specify, we can rule out like, well, there's no one else at the scene. Okay, well, I'll be even more creative and suppose that he has some other knowledge that we don't have. You can get that creative with God as well, but we don't ordinarily get that creative with everyday examples. And it's not really clear why we should with respect to God either. I guess it's just because Christians give God a lot of benefit of the doubt, and I'm inclined not to. Maybe that's this underlying difference, but I think that's the only real way you can justify not making these sort of inferences. It's just that because God is so far above us, he gets like heaps of benefit of the doubt for things that we would never ordinarily think we should excuse. God is an office clerk with a bad attitude. Yeah, something like that. I think that fits with a bunch of things, like how we've talked in the past about how much bureaucracy and paperwork there seems to be for God. Like there's all these, if you ask the theologians or the apologists, there's all these things that he can't do, or it's like, he had to fine tune the universe using the existing laws of physics and the constants that we have for some reason, like as if he couldn't just decide whatever constants he wanted. And there's all of these states of affairs that he can't directly actualize for some reason, because there's like divine bureaucracy or something like that. So I think the office clerk works in that aspect. I also think the idea that he's sort of just, the sort of stereotypical office worker who's just so emotionally withdrawn and done with their work that they just don't care about anything anymore, and they just process the paperwork, just whatever, like, okay, another horrific crime, just whatever, just waiting for the 5 o'clock clock off kind of thing. I think actually you can explain a lot if you think that God is kind of like that.
You maybe this, you can stop me if I'm getting a little too ahead. You think that, like, how could people have an intuition
at Virginia, and it was not well received, but my skepticism hasn't changed. But yeah, it's relatively secondary though, because I do think even if there are people with these intuitions, they are unjustified.
But okay, I'll try one more time. I might not be being clear here, because I think in people's mind they are thinking like this evil isn't connected to any good, and they have a set of goods in mind that the evil could bring about, like maybe happiness or something. They have a set of evils that might prevent maybe certain instances of suffering, and I think they do have a grasp of that. What they might not have a grasp of is like entailment relations, or just the idea maybe they're not.
Yeah, even Moon here isn't on board with this other guy, but I'm kind of done with talking about intuitions about evil. I think that that's much less interesting than just talking about the argument itself. Just want to see if there's anything else of interest here.
Really generally that we have a very good grasp of what God's reasons would be. So the fact that we don't, if he exists, right? So the fact that we don't know of any such reason isn't going to be good evidence that there is no such reason. So if we're framing this in a way that's not the common sense problem of evil, I think it's going to succumb to skeptical theism, as most arguments do. Although Cameron would want to say, well, look, you're wrong about the soul building theodicy. It actually is it is a good theodicy.
Yeah, so they have different takes on it. Skeptical theism is basically the idea that we don't have enough insight into God's reasons to make any judgment about whether certain outcomes are expected under under the hypothesis that God exists. I think it is the best response to the problem. Well, I think open theism might be a better response actually, but I think that gives up more than most Christians are happy to do. Skeptical theism is probably up there. I think it's better than theodicies people try to come up with, which I think are even worse. Cameron, I think, likes a greater good kind of soul building type theodicy or something. I think skeptical theism is better than that because it doesn't require you to make these incredibly ridiculous claims that like bone cancer in kids is actually good because people can be compassionate or something. It's just so stupid. Like, World War I guess, was good because it allowed people to like take care of the disabled or something. I mean, we could talk about that in more detail, but I just find it very hard to take arguments like that seriously. I think they sound okay in the abstract until you actually put specific examples in front of people's faces and then like, so the Holodomor was actually on balance good, right? Or at least allowing it to happen was on balance good. Now that's an interesting thing to say. But anyway, this guy here, sorry, his name is not in the video description, so I've forgotten what it was. He's actually leaning towards skeptical theism, which is to say that we just don't have enough knowledge about God's reasons to make any judgment. I think that's better, but I think it just requires, first of all, I think it undermines other arguments about the existence of God. I don't know how that you can make a resurrection argument work if you're a skeptical theist, because it's like, well, we know God would have good enough reasons to resurrect Jesus, but we don't know that he wouldn't have, we can't infer that he would have reasons to like stop bone cancer in children or stop genocides or things like this. I don't know what kind of position you have to be in to make one judgment and not the other. That sounds really bizarre to me. I think either you basically are pretty skeptical across the board about inferring anything about God's existence, in which case, why are you a Christian, not some general deist? Or you apply similar standards across the board, in which case, why are you not making ordinary sort of everyday type of ascriptions about God's moral character based on what he allows to happen? I just think that's a really hard circle to square to circle, whatever. But I don't know this guy's full set of positions, so maybe he has other things to say about other arguments. But I don't think skeptical theism is ultimately going to be very helpful for apologists, because it kind of rules out most of their other arguments for God's existence, which appeal to his reasons and motivations for doing things. If skeptical theism is true, why bother with God? Is like that meteorite in the Kuiper Belt. Who knows what it's like? It's like the monument to the unknown God in the New Testament. It's like, well, there's a God, I guess, but like we don't know anything about him. It's like and honestly, one does get the impression that it's like, well, we can know things about God when it suits us, when we want to say good things, but when it comes to like making bad inferences, like, well, I don't know if you can say that. It's like, how much benefit of the doubt do you have to give someone where anything that they do that appears to be good is like, oh, thank God for this, or great job, praise the Lord. But anything that appears to be bad, it's like, well, I don't know, God's ways are higher than ours. It's again, ultimate double standards, the same as always. Interesting that they have different views on this, though. I think that's interesting.
Yes, gratuitous evil exists. Theists have to spin a story.
There we go. So yeah, let's stop it there and talk about just the specific part, whether or not gratuitous suffering is in fact compatible with God's existence, which is one of the premises, like if you wanted to put his argument deductively, and I think you kind of did it earlier, like premise 1 would be something like, if God exists, no gratuitous evil exists. Premise 2, gratuitous evil does exist. So by Mollis Tollens, it follows that God does not exist. So the first premise is the one that we're looking at now, whether or not God's existence implies the absence of any gratuitous suffering. So Perry, take it away.
Right. So this is extremely controversial. I suspect that most philosophers are going to accept the view that if God exists, there's no gratuitous evil. But I don't know.
Aren't those two statements in tension? Maybe not. I mean, something can be controversial even though there's a fairly large majority on one side. Anyway, I've always held it to be the view that at least if open theism is false or other views that significantly diminish the status of omnipotence and omniscience, if a sort of a classical conception of God is true, then I don't know that you can have gratuitous evils. But I don't know. Let's see what he has to say.
I think that if we focus on philosophers of religion who write about the problem of evil, I think it's getting a bit more sketchy. I think that there's a...
Oh, dude, you can't use that line. Like most philosophers of religion work for what's the word I'm looking for? Seminaries or religious institutes, or private religious universities, particularly if we're talking about in the Anglosphere, which I assume he is. That's such a dumb argument to make.
A lot less certainty there, because there's been quite a few like relatively powerful arguments given against or for thinking that God's existence is compatible with gratuitous evil, and not really any positive arguments for that view. I mean, Rowe just says it seems to be true, and that seems to be what a lot of people are also relying on.
Well, it seems to follow at least in my mind, in a pretty straight way from the combination of the properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. I'm pretty sure that has been articulated. I mean, surely he could at least explain that's why it seems to be the case that, if God is all good and can actualize any logically possible state of affairs, then why is it that there should be evils that have no greater purpose? Like, he would just not do those, right? Because it would be better for him to not do them. I don't know. I'm sure you can make that more sophisticated, but I mean, there seems to be a prima facie case there at least.
So there's been for example, like Mike Peterson, John Hick, Mike Almeida, William Hasker, Peter Van Wegen, Justin Mooney, and so on.
What is the point of this listing of names that most people haven't heard of, including me? I think I know one or two in there, but I just, what value does that add? Like, put them in the description or something. It's just, again, whatever.
I've all raised challenges to this view, but I'll just talk about a couple of them. So one is, I'll start with Peter Van Wegen. So he identifies this moral principle that William Rowe is relying on, and he states the principle this way. He says, if one is in a position to prevent some evil, one should not allow that evil to occur, not unless allowing it to occur would result in some good that would outweigh it, or preventing it would result in some evil at least as bad. So that's kind of what he thinks the moral principle at work behind Rowe's argument is. And that seems like that's the right interpretation. That's basically what we define gratuitous evil as. And what Van Wegen does is, well, I'll make it a little more simple. He provides a counterexample to this moral principle, which if right is going to show this moral principle is false. So he asks us to consider like a judge, a good judge who is trying to pass down a just sentence. And this thief has been caught. And because of this, the judge has to sentence the thief to some time in jail. Now, the judge's sole purpose for putting the thief in jail is to deter other criminals from committing, to deter other people from committing similar crimes. And the judge hands down a sentence of 10 years. But the lawyer for the thief comes up and she says something like, Judge, you shouldn't cause this kind of suffering unless it's required for a greater good or required to prevent, the occurrence of an evil that's equally bad or worse. But, you could get the same deterrence effect if you just did 10 years minus 1 nanosecond. No person who is going to steal stuff is going to be deterred, would have been deterred by 10 years, but will not also be deterred by 10 years minus 1 nanosecond, right? And the judge says, you know what, that sounds right. And so she amends the sentence to 10 years minus 1 nanosecond. But then, the lawyer for the thief comes up again and says, Judge, you want to be perfectly good and align with this moral principle, right? But you could get the same deterrence effect if you do 10 years minus 2 nanoseconds instead of just 10 years minus 1 nanosecond. And then the judge says, yeah, that seems right. So she reduces the sentence again. And this will go on until we reach a sentence of 0 nanoseconds, or even like 2 nanoseconds for that matter. But once we reach that point, we'll have 0 deterrence effect. There will be the entire good will be lost. And so Van Wegen's point is like, well, in order to get this deterrence effect, which is supposed to be this good, right? The judge has to make a somewhat arbitrary decision, a somewhat arbitrary cutoff, and provide some sentence. And for
See, this is why people hate philosophers. It's arguments like this. Well, I was going to say this is the stupidest argument that I've ever heard, but I mean, that's not true. I've heard dumber ones. This is not anything to do with the problem of evil or gratuitous evil. This is just all about like it's paradox of the heap or vagueness or some combination of these issues. It's about how you understand the idea of, well, if you have a heap of stones or pebbles, or I think grains of sand is the typical one. If you have a heap of grains of sand, you take away 1 grain of sand, well, it's still a heap, right? I mean, a heap minus 1 grain of sand is barely distinguishable, if at all, right? So it's still a heap. But it actually follows from that then a single grain of sand is a heap, right? Well, so what are you going to conclude from that? That there's no such thing as heaps, or that you can't take away grains of sand or something like that? What it points to is some limitations. Well, in my view, what it points to is some limitations in our language. And likewise, I don't know exactly what the best resolution of paradox of the heap is. I think it's going to be something about semantic vagueness, the vagueness of sort of the meaning of terms. So whatever you're going to appeal to there as your answer to the paradox of the heap, I think is going to apply to here in a similar way. So, I mean, it's true that the deterrence effect of subtracting 1 nanosecond is not distinguishable, but it doesn't actually follow that the deterrent effect of subtracting of removing multiple nanoseconds is distinguishable. So what we're looking at here is a situation where it's sort of not clear when the truth value changes, just like in the case of the paradox of the heap, and you have to have a statement about like sort of vagueness there. In this case, it seems that there's probably I'm just sort of thinking about this on the fly. There is going to reach some point where there's going to be like, because in all psychological perceptions, there's like a smallest discriminable difference. That's the minimal amount that's perceptible with some like to human perception with some like degrees of probability, and that applies to time as well. So maybe like 100 milliseconds is the smallest. I mean, it's probably less than that, but let's say 100 milliseconds is the smallest discriminable difference. And so hypothetically, that's the smallest unit of deterrence that there is of time that there can be a deterrence for, which is going to be microscopic because it's so small, but you aggregate across that. Like, this example is just dumb. Like, you just need to think about it for a little bit and apply some fix to the issue of like the fact that there's a that it seems to be a bit vague as to when the truth value it changes to there is deterrence effect versus there is no deterrence effect. Same as it seems to be a bit vague when the heap goes away. We have to apply some fix to it, and that fix might depend on the particular application, right? Here I've applied to like minimal discernible differences as a psychological phenomena that could explain the deterrence gradually diminishes in very small units. And so theoretically, if the judge had access to that information, they would just choose the point where the deterrence effect, was exactly balancing all other considerations. Like, that's just one approach. I'm sure there are others as well, depending on how you want to approach vagueness. I just like, who cares about this stupid counterexample? It doesn't have anything to do with anything. Like, imagine that you're responding to someone who's concerned about gratuitous evil. And you're like, well, it seems that if God really cared about us, he would prevent these horrible sufferings. And you said, well, not necessarily, because that depends on this principle that if you could do something that prevented a greater evil, without incurring other costs, then you would. But then there's this counterexample where if you imagine a judge who decreases the sentence by like nanosecond amounts, you're not actually sure where it is in it. So it seems he has to make an arbitrary cutoff point. And so God also makes arbitrary cutoff points, which may be points where there's more suffering than could otherwise be. And so that exists because logically there's no, like, that doesn't just seem to address anything. Like you've just started talking about all this nonsense that doesn't address the point. I fail to see how this is. It's only interesting to philosophers because they're interested in subtleties about like, well, what is the difference between the deterrence effect of 5 years and 5 years and 1 nanosecond? And how can you understand this paradox that there seems to be no difference at that level, but then in aggregate, there's a difference? Maybe there's some interest there about philosophy of language or something, but my opinion is that has absolutely no bearing on the question of the problem of evil. And I just have even less respect for the type of arguments being presented by this guy because, oh my God, it's just, I don't even know what to say about how just irrelevant that is to anything.
Whatever sentence she gives, she could have given a slightly less sentence and gotten the same good. But the judge hasn't done anything wrong here. There's nothing impermissible she's done. Otherwise, she wouldn't have gotten as good at all. That's kind of and if that's true, and if the judge hasn't done anything wrong, then this moral principle is false. And that's to say that God's existence would be compatible with gratuitous evil because that moral principle is false. Does that make sense? Was that intuitive?
Yes, that was.
I don't know how someone can say that. Like, I just don't know what to say. I mean, I've said that you can appeal to minimal discriminable difference of units of time, and I think that gets you out of this paradox. I am sure there are other ways to do that, depending on how you want to resolve paradoxes of vagueness and continua like this. None of which seems to have anything to do with God's moral reasons for allowing evils. By the way, and this is another thing that I want to point out, even if this general principle has some exceptions to it, it doesn't follow that those exceptions are relevant to the divine case. This is why I hate this type of reasoning based on general principles, which we then try to find extremely obscure exceptions to. This is like that kid at school where you say, I don't know, no standing on the bench, and then they'll like, I don't know, they'll stand on 1 foot on it, and you're like, well, I'm hopping on the bench, I'm not standing on the bench, and they say, well, no standing or hopping, and then they'll like, I don't know, they'll do something else stupid, or they'll like put a rug on the bench, and I'm not standing on the bench, I'm standing on a rug which is on the bench. And like the point is that they always find like exceptions which are kind of dumb, but maybe technically get around what you said. I'm sure we've all met someone like this, and they're just infuriating because it's like they insist on missing the point of what you're trying to say. And in that case, maybe they're just doing it deliberately to be annoying. But sometimes, I'm not saying this is always, but sometimes philosophers seem to do this as well. It's sort of like, well, actually, you can't make this point unless you can establish this broad principle. But there's this really bizarre and obscure exception to this, and so therefore the whole point is invalidated. That's not actually how inference works in most areas of life. Most areas of life are sort of robust to small counterexamples. and I always like to give scientific examples of this, that we don't throw out quantum mechanics or relativity because there are anomalies in both those theories, and also they're hard to reconcile with each other. Theories are accepted on the basis of their overall explanatory merits, and I personally think that's how philosophical theory should be accepted as well. So this attempt to find the most, not that counterexamples are never relevant. Of course, some counterexamples are going to be very relevant, where if it's particularly if it's a real world example or something that's very similar to a real world example, maybe a slight idealization. Then that may be a relevant counterexample to the point. But when it's something like that that's so contrived and just doesn't have anything to do with anything, I just don't understand why anyone finds those convincing. It's just well, okay, even if we accept that, and that's a big if, as an exception to this principle, the principle may still be valid in almost every other case. And so it still may be appropriate to apply this in the case of God. Granted, you're not going to get a deductive relationship then between those premises, because it's not guaranteed that the conclusion follows if there's maybe some exceptions to the principle. But if the principle nearly always holds, then you're still going to get a pretty strong conclusion about God probably doesn't have good moral reasons. And so if the argument is on the basis of best explanation anyway, it's not supposed to be a deductive argument, then even if you allow for these very bizarre exemptions or exceptions, it kind of doesn't matter, because okay, how use that exception to explain to me how is it that exception explains why God still allows these certain evils? And I don't think you can, right? In which case, who cares about it? It seems irrelevant. I don't get it. Mathematicians can explain the paradox of with limits. It is calculus that deals with very small changes impact, but you need to understand mathematicians for it. I don't know that calculus explains the paradox of the heap, because I don't know that mathematics by itself tells us how we use ordinary predicates like is a heap. Calculus can be used for, calculus is usually used to describe continuous variation, which is actually not true in the case of a heap, because technically that's discrete, even if the unit is very small. We could talk about that longer, but it also doesn't seem that relevant here. People used to cheat at 44 like that in my school. Yeah, exactly. There's always a person who's can creatively work around anything, and it feels like philosophers sometimes do that more than they do to actually help us to understand what's going on here.
I don't really have anything to add to that. Andrew, did you want to respond or say anything?
He looks very worried, like an objection's coming.
Sorry, guys. I just been thinking so much about the skeptical theism and all it's great issues. Anyway, do you think Van Wagen's view requires there to be metaphysical vagueness? Sorry, this my only interest.
It definitely does. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's all. It's the idea that vagueness is really in the world. Vagueness isn't just a matter of language or knowledge or something. That there really are blurry, not sharp cutoffs.
And that's going to be controversial.
Oh, okay. Well, that's sort of what I was. I didn't use that language. That's basically what I said. So in philosophy of vagueness, there's different opinions about where the vagueness lies. And if you think that there is vagueness in the real world, I'd have to think about that more as to exactly how that relates to this objection. But then, so if you think that there is vagueness in the world, then you may have to make arbitrary cutoffs. But if you think that the vagueness is either epistemic, which is about our knowledge, but not the actual world, or it's semantic, so it's about language, which again is not the same as the world outside of language. Then if you locate the uncertainty there, then there's no actual uncertainty in the world. And so you don't need to make these arbitrary distinctions. So I think that was actually a good way to help formalize that. The sense that I had that whole objection depends on a particular notion of the philosophy of vagueness. And, that's fine. You can have positions that depend on other points, but it's just bizarre. What we heard is actually there are really strong objections to this principle. And then the first one we got turned out to hinge on a very specific interpretation of the philosophy of vagueness. Well, that's not really a very strong objection then, is it? It's pretty, especially most atheists like me. I don't know. I actually don't have data for this, but I would suspect are quite likely to locate vagueness in language rather than in the world. Now, there is quantum mechanics to deal with, but I don't think that's going to be relevant, although we could argue about that in terms of the implications of that for vagueness. But I suspect that's a different type of thing, but let's not get into that here. I don't know. That just kind of undermines the credibility of this idea that there's really powerful objections to it when the first one hinges on a very specific view about vagueness that we can just reject.
Yeah,
and also, even if you accept that it's an exception, just doesn't seem relevant to anything because, like, okay, so there's random, like, very bizarre exceptions. How does that explain why God allows, bone cancer in kids or whatever? Like, it just doesn't seem relevant. As if it could be explained by, like, well, God had to decide where to draw the line, and so he drew it here. It's like, well, we're not arguing why it shouldn't be a little bit this way or a little bit that way. We're arguing why it's here instead of, like, all the way over there. Like, why is he even close to allowing this stuff? That's kind of the point about an evil being gratuitous. It's not kind of boundary thing. Like, this seems like maybe this objection could be relevant if we were arguing, like, why does God allow us to stub our pinky, for example? That's kind of painful. It's not very nice, but it doesn't really injure anyone typically. Let's say a healthy person, like, I suppose you could have a rare condition where it turns to be necrotic or something, but, an ordinary healthy person, why can they stub their toe? Well, maybe God has to allow some types of suffering or inconveniences in order for us to grow and experience or something. And he has to draw the line somewhere, right? So he draws it there, and maybe he could have drawn it slightly differently. Okay, maybe then you can make this kind of vagueness argument in that case. How you can apply that to the examples of gratuitous evil that anyone's going to point to as being the clear cases, I just have no idea, because the point is not that there's some vagueness about exactly where to draw the line. It's that these are just very clearly and obviously well beyond any line that anyone can conceive of in their wildest dreams as being reasonable. So I don't know, unless there's some, like, vagueness underlying the cosmos that is just no one can understand, whatever. It doesn't seem relevant to me. It's just pretty weak source.
To me, what this reminds me of, this response to the analogy that you just gave about the judge and everything, reminds me of a paper by Daniel Hall's Any Amount of Suffering. You could always say, well, why that? You could always say, well, let's subtract, like, this one horrendous case. And atheists are really good at picking out horrendous cases. That's actually another interesting paper that I won't mention. But so that's what sort of stood out to me, is that when people say, like, there's too much suffering, I think that's where this really interacts and sort of undercuts that.
Yeah, but it doesn't, though. Like, the fact that it might be unclear where God draws the boundary doesn't negate the evidence that he's well over any plausible boundary that anyone could ever draw. This is a mistake to say that. Let's say there's 500 units of suffering, and I ask, why are there 500 units of suffering if God is, in the business of reducing suffering? And then the answer could be, well, there has to be some number of units of suffering, and let's say that there can't be zero. Let's just stipulate that. I mean, you might ask, why not zero? But let's say that he needs to allow some, or there's some that are impossible to remove or whatever. I don't know. And the response could be, well, there has to be some positive amount of suffering, and we don't know exactly what that amount would be. But, like, for any amount, you could always ask, well, why not less? I think there's problems to that. But the more general point is, like, we're not asking about what the number should be. We're saying that 500 is not plausible because there's so many elements of suffering there that we could just clearly do without of and not lose anything of value. So we're not arguing about whether the amount of suffering should be 4 or 5. We're saying, well, it shouldn't be 500, or more like 50,000 or something, right? The fact that you may not know where the line should be drawn, or that there's some ambiguity about where that argument should end, doesn't mean that it's not valid in extreme cases. This is like arguing that, well, there's no such thing as tall people, right? Because well, where's the boundary of tall? Wherever you find someone who you think is tall, like, what about someone who's slightly shorter than them and slightly shorter than them, right? It seems that there's no clear boundary here. And so really there's no such thing as tall people. And this is just kind of a bizarre conclusion, right? Well, no, there are, like, someone who is 2.2 meters tall. Someone who is 2.2 meters in height is tall, right? By any reasonable conception of what is tall. And the fact that there are boundary cases or uncertainties in where exactly we want to draw the line doesn't negate the existence of extreme cases. And in this case, it seems that the existence of God would preclude the existence of extreme cases. Like, there shouldn't be these obviously horrific forms of suffering. It doesn't matter if there are types of suffering that maybe we're not sure if God would allow. There are clear examples where we have good reason to think that he wouldn't allow them. So this argument that, oh, well, you could always say there should be less suffering, that's not relevant, because we're not talking about those cases. We're talking about the obvious cases where no conceivable justification can be given, apart from the ones that theists try to give, I suppose, which are kind of lacking.
You don't have, it's not as urgent in terms of, you don't have a very strong reason to go and do these things, to act your strong on to think some permission. But, if we know that is going to really undermine our moral motivation. Like, if it's true that, every instance of evil out there produces some greater good or set of goods, or prevents some equally bad or worse evil or set of evils, then we don't have, it's not so urgent to, respond to famine or respond to earthquakes or prevent serious horrendous actions that are happening. It takes away one of, like, your strongest reasons for for intervening. And he talks about this in terms of psychology, but we can it's psychologically, it might make you less inclined to do this. But we can also just think about normative reasons. Like you just lack a really, you don't have, it's not as urgent in terms of, you don't have a very strong reason to go and do these things to, help those who are suffering under famine or whatever. It's just a much less strong reason you have to do that than we originally thought. And because of that, he says, God wants us to be morally motivated. He wants us, part of, it could be that he wants us to, have significant moral freedom as well. And because of that, he allows gratuitous evil. Because if we didn't have that, again, a lot of the tragedies we see are just not as urgent as we're inclined to think they are to address. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I
What? I don't know. I should just end the stream now. Like, why do I even bother with this stuff? God allows bone cancer in kids because if there wasn't bone cancer in kids that's like gratuitous and serve no greater purpose, we wouldn't be able to cure it and show, how compassionate we are, and we wouldn't be morally motivated to do good things. Like, doesn't that mean that we should go around like torturing people because then people can I guess we have to tell people that we're torturing people because then they can come and prevent it. Like, wouldn't be good to cause suffering that no one knew about because then they couldn't do anything about it, right? But as long as people can do something about it, build character or show their virtues or whatever, then, we should be causing as much suffering as we can. What? Like, what are you talking about? God allows horrendous evils because otherwise there wouldn't be any way for us to do good by overcoming evils. So by allowing evil, God is actually bringing about good. Like, what? This is just nonsense. No one reasons this way. No one reasons morally this way. Because if you did, some of the most horrific, like Genghis Khan would be one of the greatest benefactors of all humankind. Because think of all the suffering he caused. Think of all of the good he brought into the world by allowing people to tend to the sick and to rebuild their homes and to be charitable towards each other and whatever else. Compared to those people who actually, what about the people who do good in the world, like cure disease and help? Aren't they doing bad things? But so I guess they're doing good in overcoming an evil, but they're also doing bad because in overcoming an evil, that evil is no longer there to be overcome. And so they're reducing the amount of evil in the world, which God put there for a reason, right? And they're removing it. So who are they to overcome what God did and remove the evil from the world that existed for a good reason? So aren't they kind of doing a bad thing, especially if they prevent future evils? This is even more salient. Like if you cure a disease, okay, there's the people who were sick and are no longer sick. Maybe it's good to cure them. But like, what about in the future when the disease doesn't exist anymore because you've eradicated it? Like, what about the eradication of smallpox? Was that on net bad because now we can't cure people who get smallpox and we can't, be charitable towards them and help them or whatever? Why are we curing diseases? We should be causing more diseases. We should be introducing diseases so that we can cure them and do good by that. Why are we providing robust economic systems that allow people to have readily available access to food in most countries these days? Famines are good, right? Because you can share food and you can help overcome them, and solidarity and all this stuff, and you can give alms to the poor and all this. We should be causing famines as long as there's some ability to help overcome them to an extent, right? Why are we curing diseases? We should be causing diseases. You see how ridiculous this is? No one actually takes this seriously in any other context. It's only God somehow who does this sort of thing. This is just so ridiculously stupid. Basically create more Jeff Bezos who are ruining economies and killing small business families so that we can later have somehow a better economic system. Well, aside from the economic point there, that's not even the argument. It seems to be the argument is not that it's good for us to. Well, I don't even know what it is. It seems to be the act of doing something about it is good, but I don't see how you can then say it's good for us to reach a state where it is overcome. Because, suppose we cured all disease. We found a magic pill that cured all disease this year. Let's just imagine that, right? It seems that according to this argument, that would be bad because now we don't need doctors anymore. I guess they're still aging. Let's suppose we cure that as well, just to make things simple. We don't need doctors. We don't need nurses. We don't need a healthcare system anymore. We now can't be charitable towards those who have sicknesses and other afflictions, right? Not just now, but in all future generations, all of that's gone, right? So why would it be good to do that now? Like God put those forms of suffering in the world so that we could exercise our moral agency and virtues and whatever else, how you want to phrase it, in order to help and overcome those. And if we remove them, then that would be undermining God's purpose for their existence. And so it would seem bad to remove them, and not just bad, but also contrary to God's purposes. And I think if we actually took that seriously, we should just say, screw what God wants. We're curing the disease anyway. Like, God's a prick, right? Like, what kind of an asshole does that? Now, the objection here is sometimes said, well, look, parents put obstacles in front of their children or allow obstacles to remain because children need that to learn. But first of all, there's a limit to the types of obstacles that any good parent would allow their children to face. And it's nowhere near the sorts of things that God allows his children to face, apparently. But second of all, parents only do that, and we only regard that as acceptable because there's no better way of teaching people. There's no better way of allowing children to learn sometimes than allowing them to experience some forms of adversity. We haven't come up with better ways yet for people to learn and grow other than experiencing some amounts of adversity, which again is still way less than God apparently allows his children to experience. But God obviously doesn't face that problem because, he's omnipotent and we're not. So you can't make this argument that he's like, oh, I wanted to find a better way, but, my hands are tied, like the bureaucracy argument or something. Like, this is the best way that I can teach you how to be good people, is just to like unleash horrific suffering on the world and, you'll figure it out or something. So the parent analogy just doesn't work at all. It's ridiculous in my opinion. I know that wasn't made here, but I don't know if they make it later, but I just wanted to forestall that objection. I think I'm kind of done with this video. It's getting more and more dumb as we go along. Like the first part was kind of nitpicky, but then the second part is just full of just absolutely ridiculous claims. Like God allows all of these horrific sufferings because it's good for us to overcome them. And the fact that if you sentence someone to 10 years minus 1 nanosecond, then you could iterate that, and then there's no basis for making any sentencing, and therefore you can't make inferences about what's good or bad. Like, it's just such stupid arguments that have all right, I think I've articulated that well enough. Let's take a quick look at chat and we'll finish up. Sorry I didn't quite get through the video, but I think we got through most of it as much as I can stomach. Oh, I'm not signed in on this. Oh, never mind. I want to stop sharing. What is a unit of suffering called? Well, what's a unit of pleasure sometimes called a util or a utilon. So I don't know what the opposite of that is. Maybe someone's come up with that. God can just give us nightmares. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. What if he just communicated to us through nightmares and it was all a dream that maybe all of life is a horrible dream that we'll eventually wake up from. That would be interesting. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks everyone for listening. I don't know when I'll get to a video next. I have to sort of slot them in between my other commitments and my thesis and stuff like that. I'm hoping that I might be able to do something with Nathan from Digital Gnosis in the next couple of months, but we'll see if that comes into fruition. And yeah, otherwise, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.